All right, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to some of you. Thank you for joining us for our second panel of this symposium. Before I introduce our panel this morning, I'd like to remind you that following our panel today, we'll have a short 15-minute break, followed by our keynote address by Dr. Ensign Ho. So please don't go anywhere, stick around and join us for that. Our panel here today will be a panel on genealogy, translocality, and narratives of origin in early modern Persianate societies. Let me begin by introducing our discussant and timekeeper for our panel here today, Dr. Kazuo Morimoto from the Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia in Tokyo. So thank you for joining us, Kazuo. It must be quite late where you are.
It's
7 p.m.
It's 10 o'clock at night, yes.
Well, what a better way to spend a Friday night than talking about your favorite subject, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us despite the very inconvenient hour. So we'll have three panelists this morning. I should mention, unfortunately, our second panelist for today, Ahmed Azmi, unfortunately will be unable to join us in person or virtually in person, I suppose. So we will be playing a pre-recorded video for his presentation. Our first presentation this morning will be by Dr. Manikia of Columbia University, who will be speaking on the topic of commemorating origin, place, lineages, and collectives across early modern Iran and India. So welcome, Dr. Kia. I will turn things over to you.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. So the paper that I'm going to give, and let me share my screen. The paper I'm going to give is actually drawn from my recent book. And unfortunately, with the pandemic, which included increasing teaching and advising responsibilities, lack of childcare, and constant school closures, I haven't really been able to do new research. And I think there's no shame in that, given that some of us have had to bear the burden of care in ways that are disproportionate. So just to foreground some of the issues of importance to this forum, I should highlight that I look at biographical and autobiographical narratives of origin as presented in what I call commemorative texts. And here I'm looking mainly at Tazkeres and Tarikh. But I kind of bring those texts together because they share a project of memory, as well as also citing and referencing and containing bits of one another. So for today, the main sources that I'm looking at are both regionally concerned and trans-regionally circulated. And they're not rare documents, but they're very well-known texts, and they're also published. And I'll add that many of the Tazkeres I look at in my work more broadly are newly published and have only been easily looked at in their entirety in the last decade or two with this publishing, as they run anywhere from hundreds to thousands of pages. Okay, so with that in mind, in high Persianate contexts, and this is a kind of periodization that I'm sort of playing with and using a little bit more than early modern, which I'm starting to have more and more problems with the idea of a global early modern. So the High Persianate is basically something understood as roughly the 14th to the 19th century. So in High Persianate context, a person's origins encompass inherited status, trajectory, station, relative position. Yet not every element present at birth was memorable, evoked, or narrated. Much had to be accrued, earned even. So origin was a story, a presentation whose shape was guided by adab, right? Which is a kind of term that I'm roughly glossing as proper form. It answered the question, origin stories answered the question, who are you? And provided meaning for the answer to where did you come from before you arrived here? The language of lineage was a powerful means of expression. Not only did biographical and autobiographical representation, which always began with origin, pervade commemorative texts, but lineages narratively conveyed interpretive ground. And in these narratives, geographical place was present, but part of dynamic lineages, not as a singular location. So alongside territorialized notions of origin, they were often far more important lineages, including those of service, learning, rule, aesthetics, and practice, which call into question our understanding of meaningful connection, which a lot of times, if it's not about sort of territory or place, is often about natal lineage alone. And so the argument that I make is that origins were multiple and its attributes included not only characteristics present at birth, including legacies of various ancestors, but also those acquired throughout life, which could be transmitted to descendants. Furthermore, lineages often cross the line from something we would call biological to something mythical or fictive. Before the triumph of modern positivism, lineages were proudly presented in their entirety, with little indication of where such a line might be for their audiences. Distinctions existed, but they were not the same as ours. So some things were true, some false, but in a world where certainty belonged to God alone, many were not definitively so, and thus mentioned together. So lineages connected people through both legally defined forms of kinship and those that depended on social recognition alone. And the latter was usually based on transmission of knowledge and or fulfillment of services. The language and practices that suspended or granted privileges and obligations of legal kin also marked relationships of service, tutelage, patronage, discipleship, and learning. Lineages could include kin we now define as biological, but were then defined according to birth, to wombs, and the legal relationships that created patrilineal descent or nasab. Lineage exceeded legally recognized relationships, and the shared language of kinship made other relationships part of genealogical descent. Adab, the form according to which relations between people became intelligible, gave meaning to both relationships regulated by law and those governed by social expectations alone. It governed how origins were conceived and narrated. It situated people in positions they had to assume according to its norms and related them to one another. To understand the meaning of origin and its constitutive lineages, I propose viewing kinship through the lens of adab and its apparatic or mutually constitutive logic of distinction, which is different from our ideas of categorical distinction. So individual selves and collectives were given meaning through origins, articulated as a wide range of lineages, including those of place. When foregrounded in commemoration, places marked an itinerary ultimately legible within the story of a person's substance, social station, or occupational position. Thus, alongside natal lineages and those of place, learning and service were amongst the most important lineages that commemorated origin. These events could happen in the same place, and for more modest people, they usually did. But even without travel, many new mobile individuals whose logic of origin would have been widely intelligible. Without lineages, places could suffice, but even the humble remembered their fathers, their social collectives, social ties, and homelands. And I really like showing this map because it doesn't have political boundaries. And so across the Persianate, origins were the basis of cohesion and explanation for a person or group's characteristics. And I kind of want to argue that to equate a group's origin with an ethnicity, however, is as misleading as equating an individual's origin only with their natal lineage understood as real/biological family. To make descent a matter of biology is to reduce kinship to blood and simultaneously to take a particular interpretation of a physical fact as natural. And if in theory we reject the universal applicability of, quote, the logic of the purity of blood, an ostensibly objective basis for understanding kinship, it remains as a particular notion of natural, which transmits by way of biology. And I think as English-speaking heirs of these concepts, we have to scrutinize this universalizing tendency in our analytic language and assumptions to avoid reproducing it. I'm drawing on scholarship here that has kind of historicized the concept of blood as part of a very kind of specific Western European past that then becomes universalized as modern, as the idiom of kinship. And I'm also drawing on gender studies, which has defamiliarized the natural, demonstrating that, for instance, gender creates sex as natural in order to justify itself. And so here we have to distinguish between birth, biology, and descent as naturally coeval. A lot of this scholarship led me to the question of what might refraining from these universal categories of origin show us about Persianate contexts. And then I turned to Talal Asad, who notes that no Quranic term corresponds precisely to the English kinship. There are gendered words for near relatives, spouses, and members of large collectives, marriage affines, and a host of others that refer both to formally recognized relatives and to friends. And so the polysemy of these terms underlines intimacy as the basis for words that can mean wife, brother, relative, or companion, friend, close friend. So not all of the words that he looks at are common in Persian, but the same polysemy appears among terms that refer to both legally regulated relationships and to those dependent on social recognition alone. Regardless, quote, neither in the matter of moral exhortation and prohibition, nor in that of defining succession to property rights, are the people concerned necessarily connected by biological links. So for Asad, the simultaneity of meanings linking family bonds to other intimate social bonds, quote, raises the question of how so-called primary meanings are to be determined. And just to kind of say, in other words, why must we assume that one is necessarily derivative of the other rather than co-constitutive? And one obvious example of this is the way that progenitors of Sufi orders were seen as heirs of the Prophet Muhammad, a lineage based on transmission of esoteric qualities, much as the Quran figures Muhammad as the kin of previous monotheistic prophets. Indeed, in one hadith, Muhammad is quoted as saying that the prophets are sons of one father by different mothers, and referring to them as brothers. So nothing here is biological, yet these connections are the most meaningful kinship. Here, familial language connotes common proximity to God, manifest in prophecy and enacted perfection. So extralegal kinship was thus socially recognized and part of a spectrum that included legally sanctioned relations. And another example of this is service constituted one of these kinds of relations and was often discussed in contractual terms used for marriage as sireh. And legally, this is a term that denotes a proper way to offer a contract. The language and forms of legal kinship were thus invoked for extralegal kinships, bringing the idealized intimacy of one to the other, overlaying such relationships with the familial that could then be realized by adoption or marriage, or not always. But I think that the point is that, again, in the context of learning, this could lead to overlapping lineages of origins, right? Where teachers could become father-in-laws, but the dual meaning of khalaf, right? As son or successor or both, underscores that a knowledge ancestor need not necessarily share a nasab tie to figure significantly in a person's origin. Learned descent was thus co-constituted by words connoting legally defined kinship and recognized as genealogy. So I'm going to zero in now on a couple of examples. I'm going to start with a discussion of Lutf Ali Azad Begdeli, his text, the Atash Kadeh, which is a poetic tazkere, whose primary purpose is to recenter Persian poetic culture and its lineages of participants on Araq Ajam. The section on his contemporary poets contains an autobiographical account of his origins, which I closely read here to consider individual and collective lineages and their relation to the category Turks as an ethnicity. And here I want to draw a distinction between between social collectives and the concept of ethnicity, which I think we cannot collapse. So Turco-Mongol descent with lineages of discipleship and service to key rulers such as Timur and the Safavids defined Azad. Timurid lineages share features of other Turco-Mongol lineages, even of service to Chengiz Khan's line, though Timurids are primarily distinguished by rulership, which is why I discuss Azad's lineage alongside the Timurid Emperor Akbaz, as narrated in the imperial chronicle, the Akbarname. What we see in these disparate texts is rather than ethnic Turkish tribes, Turco-Mongol lineages were distinct social collectives connected to the history of Persianate kingship across multiple lands. And such meanings are present in Azad's self-representation. And here I'm trying to save time by not reading these quotes. And I'll just leave it up for you to look at. So the Begdeli lineage is an origin unto itself, with place as a distinguishing marker for its subgroups, which kind of explains the absence of Shamlu in Azad's original statement about, the origin of this traveler, right? Is the Dude of Begdeli. So that he is specifically a Begdeli Shamlu is stated towards the end, a particularizing feature of his origin's core. So Shamlu is a place name moniker shared with other lineages, which functions both to distinguish the itinerary of a subset of the Begdeli collective and to mark a particular Shamlu collective distinguished by its arrival from Syria to Iran and its service to the Safavids, right? Thereby answering the question of where were you before you arrived here? Azad's origin story is about three main collectives: his family line, the larger Begdeli, the larger Begdeli and Shamlu groups. His family lineage accrues meaning not just from its early ancestors, who populate Persianate universal histories, but also from its role in a wider story of trans-regional Persianate ruling authorities of Sheikh and Shah. As the narrative subject shifts, different singular and plural words refer to a group of people, and the terms he uses are ta'ifeh, tabaqeh, duded, nasab, guruh, right? Very, very generic terms. So I think that for the Begdeli collective, over which his family holds leadership and to whom it gives its name, he uses ta'ifeh interchangeably with qabileh, which is the term most often used for tribe. Oghuz Khan becomes the Jamshid of the Turks, right? And this is the text. And overlaying his lineage with one of illustrious rule from Persianate universal histories. I think the point that I wanted to make is that family line, and I'll come back to this slide, right? Family line and social collective are distinctive, but not completely, right? The last statement, some of the Begdeli are Shamlu and some of the Shamlu are Begdeli, speaks the logic of aphoretic categorization. Even after the coherence of the Shamlu has been established in the narrative, the Begdeli remain a coherent group within other collectives. And so this simultaneity of belonging, right, which is neither an accident or a contradiction, is yet another distinction from modern notions of ethnicity. It applies even to Begdel Khan's direct male line. The ruling lineage names the collective, yet they remain a distinct family. And here kinship derives from relations of rule. Azad may share legally defined kinship with individuals in other groups and not with members of his own collective. So this family and collective's initial migration out of Turkestan took place either during the reign of Sultan Mahmud or the conquest of Chengiz Khan, right? And it's presented in a way that either is likely and neither is certain. And the next event is the arrival of Timur in Syria, where he recognizes the lineage of the group. In response, given the worthiness and shared language of the Syrian-based Begdeli Shamlus, he relocates those groups along with other Turkic groups to Iran, intending to return them to Turkestan. The Begdelis are one subset among the Shamlu who become defined as such in Ardabi, distinguished from the Begdelis who had originally remained in Iran. So the Shamlu thus cohere around a return that never happens, in effect a departure, and become a singular people, a Qom, by acquiring an origin narrated through lineages of discipleship and service to the Safavids. And the question I kind of come to is, so thus far, social collectives are constituted by lineages of natal descent, rules, service, distinguished sometimes by their
1
itineraries,
minute
language.
left, so please conclude.
Okay. So I am very far from getting through what I needed to get through, and I'll just stop there because I did pre-circulate the paper. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kia, for that presentation. Our next presentation will be from Ahmed Al-Mazmi, a PhD candidate at Princeton University, who will be speaking on the topic of the politics and poetics of genealogical traditions, the divergence of Baloch genealogical ideologies between the 16th and the 18th centuries. As I mentioned, we will be watching a pre-recorded video of his talk. So, Pete, I guess you'll be queuing that up.
In this paper, I ask, what can the patronized poetic literature reveal about the politics of competing genealogical ideologies in the rapidly changing post-Nazarbayev Persianate world? Through analyzing the competing political claims enmeshed in Persian poetics and Baloch politics, my paper extends the analytical scope of Persianate connected histories during the political re-emergence of borderlands regions out of the Safavid Mughal empires. Situated in Balochistan, this paper demonstrates the dynamic ideological functions of genealogy. I begin with identifying the folkloric genealogical traditions of the Baloch in the medieval period. This is accomplished through tracing poetic traditions transmitted collectively and orally in Balochi language. The early oral traditions, like in many other Islamicate societies, anchored the Baloch tribal genesis and ancestors in an Islamic Shiite narrative that claims a Qurayshi origin. However, this early and long-lasting tradition was challenged during the political consolidation of Baloch tribes in a single polity by the mid-17th century. By drawing on the political and literary oeuvre of the 18th century poet Qadi Nur Muhammad Ganjabavi Noorani, my paper locates in this early modern period of Persianate textual production a change in the genealogical traditions, and thus attempts to answer why have the Baloch genealogical traditions changed in the early modern period. Under the patronage of the local Baloch rulers, a realignment of the Baloch with different patrilineal origins was produced through the medium of textual Persianate poetics. The growing scholarship on the ethnohistory of the Baloch has not examined this unprecedented change of the local genealogical traditions during the early modern period. My paper will not delve further into the production of scholarship on the question of the ethnogenesis of the Baloch by the various factions. I will, contrary to the previous studies on the ethnic identity of the Baloch, incorporate the early Balochi genealogical oral traditions and contrast them with the Persianate local textual sources. My aim is to analyze the indigenous genealogical traditions and the subsequent fluctuations that reflected the geopolitical realities and cultural transformations during the political consolidation of the Baloch tribes. Being a non-standardized narrative, the details of the Balochi epic ballads vary in content and form across the dialectical landscape of Balochistan. The British civil servants and explorers first documented the oral versions in the 19th century. Despite their variations in length, all of the transmitted ballads share three common themes. First, in them we find the Baloch are descendants of the Prophet Muhammad's paternal uncle, Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib. Second, they are organized in 44 tribes that fought alongside the Prophet's grandson, Al-Husayn bin Ali ibn Abi Talib, against his Umayyad enemies in Karbala. After their defeat, the Baloch wholesale immigrated from a place called Halab or Alab and moved eastward to the Iranian plateau and gradually reached the Indus and beyond. This popular tradition does not withstand historical scrutiny since the mythical patriarch's offspring all died without progeny. There is no attestation of any Baloch during the Battle of Karbala, and of course the presence of the Baloch in their current habitat is attested and predates the events in the tradition, this is part of the tradition that is written in this collection of poems of Balochi oral traditions and published by a Baloch scholar, which mentions the incident of fighting alongside Hussein. It is not clear what are the sources of this Shiite influence tradition. Kirman, Sistan, and Makran all had sizable Shiite populations in the 9th century, as well as Kharijites. It is likely that the source of this tradition is late and emerged between the 12th and the 14th centuries due to its inclusion of tribal leaders from that period as actors in the migratory movements from the west to the east. The Persian Shiite historian Muhammad Qasim Hindu Shah, known as Frishta, who lived in the mid-16th to mid-17th century, in his Tarikh Frishta, reported that Shahdad, the son of the most powerful Baloch tribal chief, Mir Chakar Rind, who lived in the mid-15th to the mid-16th century, was the first disseminator of Shiism in India or Hindustan. According to the historian, the Baloch historian Badal Khan, quote, as such, it is quite possible that some poet might have invented a tradition claiming direct descent from the family of the Prophet, having come from the Arabian Peninsula, exactly the way majority of Shias in the Indian subcontinent add the prefix of Sayyid to their names, claiming they are descendants of the Prophet, end of quote. Nonetheless, Frishta's alleged origins of Shiism in the Indian subcontinent is indicative of the increasing importance of the Baloch chieftains among the Persian literati in the region as patrons of increasing importance by the 17th century. Similarly, as noted by the British explorer Richard Burton in Sindh, the Sindhi historian Ali Shah Qana Tatwi, who lived in the early 18th century, propagated in his Tuhfat al-Kiram an additional detail to the popular narrative of the Baloch origins. In this account, Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib has begotten the Baloch by a fairy, a pari, who gave birth to their forefather, who in another version is also identified as Muhammad bin Harun bin Dira' al-Namri, one of the Umayyad leaders in the conquest of the Indus Valley during the governorship of Al-Hallaj bin Yusuf al-Thaqafi in Iraq. The story, according to Burton, is probably, quote, in order to flatter the clan, end of quote, and to find a genealogical connection in the attested history of early Islam in Sindh, I would add. Despite the sectarian and legendary origins of this narrative, it echoes some historical events such as the regional hostilities towards the Baloch tribes due to their heterodox beliefs and the continuous expansion of their settlements towards the Indian subcontinent. The early modern change in the Baloch genealogical traditions. This is an imagined sketch of Nasir Khan Ahmed Zai, the ruler of Balochistan during the 18th century, and this is a poem in his praise in the Jangnama that I'll be talking about. In 1666, the Baloch Kambarani tribal confederacy established its capital in Kalat, in eastern Balochistan. The clan of the Ahmadzais became the ruling dynasty of Balochistan, and it adopted, alongside Balochi, Persian language as the lingua franca for internal and external official affairs and chancery. During this Persianate Khanate, Persian literary production developed, and through that, a novel notion of belonging and historical past was imagined. The Baloch aforementioned genealogical traditions were reincorporated in this growing body of literature. However, it went through significant changes, which either attempted to support the credibility of the Hamza lineage or offer other sources for a prestigious and unifying progeny located in the changing political landscape of courtly cultural politics in the early modern period. A significant change in the genealogical traditions occurred by the turn of the 18th century. Qadi Nur Muhammad Ganjabavi, whose pen name is Noorani, introduced an unprecedented genealogical foundational narrative of the Baloch. This part of my talk will outline his biography and political connections to the regional centers of power to contextualize his writings on the early Baloch history, which you can see in the slide, this poem. A little bit about the poet to make sense of his poetry. Qadi Noorani was born in the area of Ganjaba in eastern Balochistan to his father Qadi Abdullah, known as Kalhora, who after serving for a number of years as a jurist participated in a war as an archer in Kalat's army, in which he was killed. Coming from a line of maritors, Noorani, like his father and ancestry, preserved the influence of the family and thus was close to the center of power in Kalat at Nasir Khan Nouri's court, who lived between 1747 to 1795. Noorani was a successful jurist and a popular poet, qualities that promoted him to be the chief Qadi al-Qudat, who oversaw the provincial courts of Balochistan during the Durrani Ahmadzai invasion of Punjab against the Sikhs in 1763. Despite being rooted in central Balochistan, Noorani experienced high geographic mobility, traveling with his patron Nasir Khan Nouri to the adjacent regions in the subcontinent and Afghanistan as the court poet of the Baloch Ahmadzai capital in Kalat. His poetry was primarily in the Mathnawi form, poems of rhyming couplets, dedicated primarily to the Durrani Ahmadzai joint military alliance and political cause. Noorani wrote and dedicated his Jangnama Tuhfat al-Nasiri, or Tuhfat al-Nasir, a collection of 3,500 verses, to Nasir Khan Nouri, the ruler of Balochistan. In this work, he rewrote the Baloch history by introducing a different account of the ancestral imagined past. The Jangnama is divided into sections under 55 subheadings or bayans, statements. The first 5 sections are devoted to eulogizing God and Prophet Muhammad, as per the tradition, and to exalting Ahmad Shah Durrani and Mir Nasir Khan Ahmadzai. The remaining sections concern Persian poetic traditions, authorship, and reasons for composing the epic. The Jangnama then discusses, alongside the history and ancestry of the Baloch people, Nasir Khan's reason for the military campaign against the Sikhs. The last section of the book are related to the Sikhs, their warfare skills and character, as well as their territorial possessions in northern India, Punjab, and Sindh. Noorani's notion of Baloch identity is based on his sense of belonging to his community, for which he sought to establish a genealogy that is exalted and politically advantageous. He inquired, and I'm quoting him, "Inform me, what is the origin of the Baloch, their name and genealogy, due to which these people are treasured in the world," which you can read in the slide. Answering himself, he constructed 2 genealogical stemata for the Baloch. one of which is Islamic in connecting the Baloch to the Prophet's family and the lands of the Arabs, which is a continuity of the Baloch oral genealogical traditions that I've talked about. And the other is Afghan Israelite in connecting the Baloch to a common Israelite ancestry, who is Asaf ibn Barkhia, the vizier of Solomon, the biblical figure. This ancestry is shared with the Afghans by being the descendants of Asaf ibn Barkhia, who fathered two children. One is Afghan and the other is Balo. Noorani reiterated what was circulating among the Baloch Bards. However, he switched from their popular genealogical accounts to another that was unknown among the Baloch, as we do not find someone by the name of Balo in the textual or oral traditions. Likewise, the 17th century was also a watershed in the Pashtuns' genealogical traditions. The genealogical history of Ni'matullah's Tariq-e Khan Jahani, a work composed in India in the 17th century, also propagated an Israelite origin traced to Qais Abdul Rashid, son of Afghana. I'm quoting the professor Al Green, the grandson of the Israelite king Saul, who served as military commander for King Solomon and from whom Afghans take their name. According to the historian Sajjad Nijatai, I'm quoting him, in cultivating a sense of ancient solidarity between the tribes in this way, the myth of Israelite descent conveniently papered over the reality that the Afghans were an ethnically heterogeneous people whose Islamicization was gradual and uneven. End of quote. The earlier quote as well is by Sajjad Nijatai. Thus, Ni'matullah's and Noorani's projects were based rewriting the ethnogenesis of the Pashtuns and the Baloch. However, Noorani was concerned to find a way to link the Pashtuns genealogically to the Baloch, whereas Ni'matullah was concerned only with the genealogy of the Pashtuns. Noorani attempted to create a genealogical homogenizing narrative that would appeal to both the Baloch and the Pashtuns. His account drew on genealogical elements among the Afghan poets. Their poems popularized the idea of an Israelite genealogy, and Noorani deployed this linkage with his northeastern neighbors and extended it to include the Baloch. According to the historian Al Green, quote, a prominent characteristic of the historiography patronized by the Afghans of the Mughal and post-Mughal period was an obsession with the question of Afghan ethnogenesis, end of quote. This marked obsession was also shared by the author of the Jangnama, which, although bridged the historical gap between the two groups, was not echoed in the historiography patronized by the Afghans. The Baloch poet's influence seems to be restricted to his Baloch milieu only, which I might be wrong about, but this is what I found so far. To authenticate an inclusive ethnogenesis, Noorani supported the Afghan and Baloch common origins assertion not only by a monotheistic Israelite heritage popular among the Afghans, but also by listing undisputable facts that unite the two groups, as he claims, using a socio-cultural rubric that goes beyond a shared descent. And listing shared ethnic markers among the Baloch and the Pashtuns, Noorani foregrounded the geographic proximity between the two. Moreover, the area ecology was another factor, as both groups dwelled in dry lands and lived in black tents, according to him. Additionally, they both cherished hospitality and provided refuge. Most importantly, according to Noorani, they are both devoted Sunnis who rejected the Shiites' creed. Noorani then continued narrating the Baloch migrations and history until the times of his patron Nasir Khan Noori. Noorani's constructed imagined past of the Baloch is a notable genealogical development. It evidently served certain political realities that were imaginatively projected onto the past, in which the Baloch and the Pashtuns are in an alliance against the Shiites and the Sikhs during the early modern period. They also express, similar to the Afghans of the Mughal and post-Mughal period, the patron of Nurani's religious views and desired origins that differentiated the Baloch from their non-Sunni neighbors, which is a whole different topic to talk about. I can't really delve into this much. However, the genealogical discourse was politicized and reinvented once more, for it was an effective tool in harmonizing diverging histories and alliances in times of political upheavals. To conclude, the question of the Baloch ethnogenesis has been thus far examined as either a historical and an ethnological inquiry to be definitely answered, or framed as a mere factor in valorizing a sense of belonging to an imagined community that shares a common ancestry. My research rather traced and analyzed when, how, and why the Baloch have claimed a genealogy situated in Islamic and Arabian history through contextualizing their ethnogenesis historically as an invented tradition with political utility and functions. The Baloch traditions and their development in the early modern period cannot be understood thus without contextualizing them in the Persianate cultural production and regional politics that connected them to the Pashtuns. The older genealogy of the Baloch bards and their sources gave way to a novel source stemming from a new political context that introduced the Pashtun traditions among the Baloch. My work has argued thus that the post-Nadrid period witnessed the emergence of a new politicized genealogical discourse that mobilized kinship, sectarianism, and political alliance above the previous popular traditions. It was to fulfill the ideological motives of its propagators in unifying and connecting the Baloch Ahmadzai Khanate based on changing sectarian and political interests to the increasingly hegemonic Durrani Empire. Therefore, here the social meaning of genealogy fluctuated as a contested site and a multi-purpose tool according to changing political and ideological projects in Balochistan and beyond.
Okay, our next and final presentation will be by Dr. Daniel Sheffield, also of Princeton University, who will be speaking on the topic of Parsi genealogy and negotiated sovereignty in Mughal Gujarat. Dr. Sheffield, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Daniel. While I get my keynote up here, I'm just going to apologize if it sounds like there's a thunderstorm going on here at any time. It's because my daughter upstairs is in virtual gym class, but we'll just have to make do. Okay, I'm just going to dive right in here for the purposes of time. Recognizing the importance of the intergenerational bond of lineage, Peiwand, is a constant theme throughout Zoroastrian literature. Already in the most ancient texts of the Zoroastrian corpus, the stretching out of lineages over generations is a means through which the good elements of the cosmos are woven together by the supreme deity Ahura Mazda, ultimately resulting in the defeat of his adversary Angramanyu, the evil spirit, and the rebirth of the cosmos at the end of time. According to the Middle Persian Book of Advice of Zarathustra, likely redacted in the 9th century of the Common Era, the question of what lineage, Peiwand, and family, Tomag am I, is one of the first questions that a child should be able to answer before any question of ethics or theology. Given this, it's not surprising that extant Zoroastrian literature, for virtually all attested periods, is rich in genealogical material. Zoroastrian texts from the first millennium of the Common Era and Middle Persian, such as the one I just cited or the one that you can read here on the slide, are filled with questions relating to the family, inheritance, and the performance of religious duties on behalf of one's deceased ancestors. Zoroastrian practices of kinship, were a curiosity for outsiders, especially the trope of next of kin marriage, which one meets with in sources as old as Herodotus's history and still frequently encountered, one frequently encounters it today. Much of what has been said in the past about Zoroastrian understandings of kinship has thus focused on the ancient period and on matters such as the relationship of genealogy to cosmology, or on questions of comparative law in antiquity and in late antiquity. This is not the focus of today's paper. Instead, I'll be discussing early modern documents found in family and community archives preserved by the Zoroastrians of Western India, the Parsis. Here, just an example of a modern Parsi family tree. These materials found in Sanskrit, Gujarati, Persian, and Marathi provide a glimpse into the social life of the Parsi priestly community and its connections to the broader worlds around them. These documents not only provide vast amounts of genealogical information, which provided the raw material for the publication of large-scale family histories during the 19th century, but allow us to see how constructions of genealogy, both real and fictive, related to constructions of authority both within and outside of the Parsi community. Today, after a brief introduction, I'll try to present two sets of documents relating to priestly inheritance. One disclaimer that I'll mention at the outset of the talk while everyone is still paying attention, so that it doesn't cause confusion later, is that the documents that I will discuss today all involve the Zoroastrian custom of appointing a son and heir for a male priest who has died without child. This is a sort of uniquely Zoroastrian institution, whereby it is religiously mandatory for any deceased individual to have a living, quote unquote, child who inherits part of his estate on the one hand, but who is also responsible for performing religious ceremonies for the deceased after his death. In Middle Persian, this is called stur or proxy. In New Persian or Farsi, this is called polgozar, or the guy who helps you get across the bridge. And in Gujarati, this is called a politic, or I guess you could say a warden of the estate. This uniquely Zoroastrian interpretation of inheritance is well attested in late antique sources, but became the source of controversy in early modern India when it was used to challenge structures of priestly authority in long-standing conflicts pitting families of priests and laity against one another, who in turn reached outside the community to other structures of authority for support. Now, by way of introduction, it's necessary to say a few words about sources and about Parsi historical memory more broadly. Though archaeological and epigraphic evidence suggests that there were likely communities of Iranian traders residing in Western India since at least the Sasanian period, if not long before, Parsi texts trace the origins of their community to a migration of a small number of Zoroastrians who set sail from Iran and arrived in Gujarat in Western India during the Abbasid period. Here you can see a map of most of the modern state of Gujarat. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Indian geography, you can sort of orient yourselves, I suppose, via Mumbai, which appears there in the south, Bombay. Our earliest textual evidence for Zoroastrians in and around the Gujarat region comes from Middle Persian inscriptions found in caves in the north of modern Mumbai from the 10th century, and from manuscripts written in Gujarat and also in Sindh to the northwest during the 13th and the 14th centuries of the Common Era. In the pre-modern period, Zoroastrian communities, both in Iran and in India, maintained a distinction between lay and priestly classes. The Zoroastrian laity is typically referred to by the term behdin, or a person of the good religion, while members of the priestly class are referred to by the collective term Gujarati atornan, or by priestly titles such as mobed, herbed, and dastur. Male members of the priestly group were eligible to undergo 2 levels of initiation ceremonies as children, which would enable them to perform and to be compensated for the numerous rituals which were the rites of the priestly class and which were performed at numerous occasions throughout the ritual year. This included family rituals such as those pertaining to birth, coming of age, marriage, and death, things like the butchering of animals and the preparation of ritual feasts, the inner rituals of the fire temple, and other numerous miscellaneous rituals which I don't need to describe here. Membership in the priestly class was transmitted through the paternal line, though most pre-modern texts also strongly encourage members of the priests not to marry lay women except in cases of necessity. Priests of the early modern period were generally literate, indeed, judging from extant manuscripts, sometimes very highly literate, often in multiple languages, not just able to copy, but also to compose original texts in Pahlavi, Persian, Sanskrit, and Gujarati. The vast majority of extant Zoroastrian manuscripts were copied by priests, for whom being a scribe was something of a side gig in addition to their ritual duties, who typically included genealogical information about themselves and their patron in the form of manuscript colophons. By contrast, only a very small number of compositions written before the year 1800 survive that were composed or written by lay people. Now, in India, one's ability to perform priestly rituals depended not just upon being born into the priesthood, but by being born into the right priestly jurisdiction. Here is a sort of more indigenous understanding of Gujarat geography, a map of the Gujarati coast from 1750, in which you can see the Gulf of Cambay in the north, in that city with the sort of Jama Masjid there is Cambay or Kambat, and then running down the right-hand side of the page are the many ports on the western coast of Gujarat. Parsi historical memory, as Parsi memory, focuses on a single migration which established the community in India. Virtually all Parsi priests trace their their descent to a single common ancestor, a priest by the name of Shapur Sheriar, whose descendants eventually split into distinct priestly groups. Though we know only a little about the organization of the priesthood from the scant written sources of the 13th and 14th centuries, by the middle of the 15th century, sources refer to Indian priests as belonging to one of 5 pantaks, which you can see here at the right of the slide. And it's Gujarati for regional division, which corresponded to a geographical distribution of the ancient settlements of the Parsis in Western India. Today, I'll only be focusing on 2 of these groups, those Parsi priests whose ancestors lived between the Pardi and the Dhanu regions, centered in the village of Sanjan near Daman, which you can see here down towards the bottom of the slide, belonged to the Sanjana Pantak, while those immediately to the north, between the Pardi and the Tapti River, including the town of Navsari, and the Mughal port of Surat, belonged to the Bagaria Pantak, while those who lived between rivers still to the north belonged to the 3 other Pantaks. Each of these groups was granted the exclusive rights to perform rituals within their territory and were forbidden from profiting from rituals in the territory of another group, as we know from an agreement document signed in the 15th century and numerous later documents contesting this agreement. Such neat geographic divisions, however, seem to have been contested throughout the historically attested period. In particular, priests from the Sanjana Pantak seem to have left Sanjan for Navsari in large numbers during the violent circumstances of the 15th century. They carried with them the sacred fire, known as Iran Shah, the oldest and highest grade fire in India. And after installing that fire in Navsari, it was agreed that the emigrant priests from the Sanjana Pantak would be permitted to perform and profit from ceremonies for the fire in Navsari, but all other religious ceremonies would be performed by priests from the Bagaria Pantak. Priestly rights were thus both frequently contested and fiercely guarded. Who among the priests had the authority to make decisions and reach agreements with other groups? Did a high-ranking priest bequeath his authority to his heirs, or should his position pass to appear on the basis of merit? Which priests had the right to perform rituals in new settlements which lay beyond the 5 rivers? Did a lay merchant traveling outside the home region require a priest also to travel with him to provide ritual services, or could he employ a local priest who was to perform the wedding ceremony of a bride and groom from different regions? Such questions became especially heated as the fortunes of individual settlements waxed and waned with the silting of ports, the ravages of inter and intra-regional warfare, and the constantly changing patterns of agriculture and trade, which were characteristic of Western India more broadly. The resolution of these questions was often enmeshed in genealogical claims, which I'll be coming to presently. We have numerous sort of forms of extant genealogical documents kept by the Parsi community, a few of which I've written about in the paper, and you're welcome to to have a look at the full form of the paper when you have some time in the afternoon, perhaps. In what follows, I'll examine two groups of documents which relate genealogy to claims of communal authority. In both groups of documents, this authority is formed at the nexus of the priestly families of Navsari on the one hand, and officials from the Mughal state on the other. This intermediary authority of the Parsi Anjuman, that is the collective body of Parsi priests, I refer to elsewhere as negotiated sovereignty, in which certain sovereign rights are ceded by local and state actors to an intermediary body which functions as a sort of proxy to facilitate the sort of escalation and de-escalation of matters between the sort of local and state levels. Okay, coming to my first document here, a Gujarati language document dating to the reign of the Gujarat Sultan Muzaffar Shah, who reigned from 1511 to 1526, survives in a family archive in Navsari as one of the earliest extant legal documents pertaining to the Parsis. It's obviously in Gujarati. It details a land grant, an in'am, to the Parsi priest Rana Jaisung. The text is shown on the slide, and I'll let you all read it to yourselves here for a moment. Like many similar documents, the text at first blush seems to tell us very little. We have a date, a king, a collection of names with very little context, a short description of a parcel of land, details of how its income should be treated, and a long list of witnesses. In short, a priest of Navsari, Rana, son of Jaisung, has been granted the income of a small toddy farm, that is a farm of palm trees, whose fruits can be eaten, and more importantly, whose sap can be used to make liquor, by the Sultan of Gujarat for an unstated reason. Reading further in the documents, we soon come to another very similar document, though, from a half century later, still in Gujarati. In form, this document is more or less the same, though the reigning monarch is now the Mughal king Akbar, and a few more details about the land parcel are given. We now know that there are date palms in addition to toddy palms, and the land is located somewhere.
5 minutes left.
5 minutes. Yeah, this goes quick. The recipient of the land grant here is named as Mahyar, son of Vacha, also a priest. To understand who this Mahyar, son of Vacha is and how he relates to Rana, son of Jaisung, we need to say a brief word about Zoroastrian succession. In Zoroastrian practice, it is necessary for all deceased male individuals to have a child and heir at the time of their death. The child performs religious rituals for the deceased and receives a share of the deceased's estate. It, of course, happens on countless occasions that Zoroastrians die with no natural offspring. Since late antiquity, Zoroastrian texts mandate that a child, preferably a son, be appointed for them, called in Gujarati a palak. Coming back to this Mahyar, we read in a death register copied in the archives of the Bagaria Anjuman of Navsari the following entry. The first Dastur, Meherji, son of Rana, is the palak, that is the adopted son of his paternal uncle Vacha. He became his heir in 1619 Samvat, or 1562 of the Common Era. He himself died in 1590 of the Common Era. For religious purposes, Mahyar was to be considered the adoptive son of his father's elder brother Vacha, who had apparently died childless in 1562. Coming back to the land grant, even though the document does not name his biological father, simply his adoptive father, still it appears that he was successful in securing the income of his biological father's Inam land, even as the Mughals displaced the Gujarat Sultanate that had originally issued the grant. From a few years later, we find another document concerning the same Mahyar, adoptive son of Vacha. This time, the document does not pertain to the state, but rather to Mahyar's authority within the priestly Anjuman of Navsari itself. Here, issued 7 years after Akbar's land grant, we see Mahyar is now an authority figure of considerable standing. Essentially, the document tells us that all profits from performing religious ceremonies in Navsari must first be presented to Mahyar before they can be distributed among the priests. Indeed, Mahyar has become so authoritative a figure that he's not only given the profits of his own Navsari Bagaria Pantak, but the profits of the Sanjana Pantak operating in their fire temple in Navsari too. I don't have time to go through the further documents of this group, but we see that Mahyar's rights both to this land and his rights as authority figure within the community are transmitted to his son Kekobad, and from Kekobad down into their descendants, stretching down into the 18th century. I'll just very briefly speak of another group of examples. In those that we just saw, by the 16th century, heredity, both real and fictive, not only determined a priest's ability to perform religious rituals on behalf of others in a certain geographic area, but it could be used to lay claim to authority within the Nafsari Anjuman, both in terms of ritual practice and in terms of relationship with the Mughal state. Yet hereditary claims could also be used to contest that authority. We find many documents in the 17th century revealing that many groups were unhappy with the authority of the Bagaria Anjuman and its ranking families. Among these included lay families who objected to the Anjuman's ability to decide which priests would perform rituals rather than letting lay people choose their own priests. And more than anyone else, priests of the Sanjana priestly Pantak seem to have grown very dissatisfied with the Bagarias in restricting their ability to profit from rituals in Navsari. Now, one loophole that it seems that the Sanjanas were able to find and to exploit in order to gain access to more lucrative ritual opportunities concerned this institution of adoption of palak in Gujarati for childless individuals. Recall that Mahyar, whom we just discussed, was himself was adopted on behalf of his deceased uncle Vacha, apparently without controversy. We read repeatedly in death registers, Disapoti of the 17th century, entries such as the following, which I'll just briefly summarize. What evidently had happened here was that a Bagaria priest by the name of Jiva Shair Chand had died without an heir. This Jiva had married a daughter from the other Pantak. He had married a priest, the daughter of a priest from the Sanjana Pantak, but had no living child at the time of his death. After his demise, apparently without consulting the Navsari Anjuman, his widow appointed her own nephew, rather than a member of his family, to be his successor. Her nephew Peshtan, formerly a Sanjana priest, to be the Palak heir of her deceased Bagaria husband. From then on, this formerly Sanjana priest would be considered to be the son of Jiva and a member of the Bagaria Anjuman. In effect, he had switched from the Sanjana Pantak to the Bagaria Pantak via this institution of sort of fictive adoption. He could further appoint his own children or his own relatives to be his heir and profit from all the rituals, marriages, death rituals, etc., that had been forbidden to them as Sanjana priests. Thus, a situation in 17th century Navsari began to emerge where Sanjana priests were entering into the Bagaria Anjuman through adoption and thus began to share the profits of Bagaria rituals. This further exacerbated conflicts between the laity and the priesthood, as Sanjana lay families apparently tried to have priests of Sanjana biological descent who had been adopted into the Bagaria Anjuman perform their family rituals. There are dozens of extant documents which relate to this conflict. I think Coswell is telling me that I don't have time to talk about them, so I will not do that. I'll just leave an interesting document here on the slide and come, I think, to my conclusion. This is a document detailing a resolution by the Navsari Anjuman forbidding a widow from appointing her deceased husband's adopted son without the approval of the Anjuman first, a document which dates to 1675. All right, I'll just quickly come to the conclusion then. In later documents, we read that the descendants of Peshtan Jiva, the Sanjana priest who joined the Bagaria Pantak, continued to agitate within the Anjuman for the right of the laity to choose their own priests. The conflict eventually led to riots in Navsari in 1686, in which 2 Bagaria priests were murdered and a group of 5 lay people died in the ensuing riot. After a series of decisions from the court of the Qazi of Surat repeatedly ruled in favor of the rights of the Bagaria Anjuman to restrict who could perform rituals for the laity, the Sanjana priests ultimately decided to leave Navsari en masse. The fire was brought back to the ancestral Sanjana domain and installed in the village ultimately of Udvada near Daman. To conclude, what I've tried to demonstrate here today is how heredity operated within the early modern Parsi priesthood. These claims were recognized both by priestly families and by the Mughal state itself. Even in this document here, you can see a reference to the Divan at the end, sort of recognizing the ability of the Anjuman to act on behalf of the Mughal state in regulating Parsi affairs. The Anjuman in turn issued decisions to regulate priestly behavior and to mediate conflicts between different groups. The negotiated sovereignty of the Anjuman and the hereditary structures of authority it embodied was a stable institution within Navsari, even as the states around it were not, maintaining its intermediary role from the Sultanate period of our earliest documents all the way down to the present. It's still an active body in the city, albeit with significant transformations under the colonial and post-colonial states. Heredity, though, as we've seen, was never a simple affair, even as seemingly archaic legal institutions such as adoptive succession could be reinterpreted in new contexts to circumvent contentious structures of authority. Thanks very much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dan. Now I can say from my side, I'm definitely going to have to go back and reread all of these papers again. There's just so much rich material here. We have added Dan's paper as well now to the shared drive. So we'll definitely be revisiting a lot of these issues here. Let me turn things now over to Kazuo for some commentary, followed by questions.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much, all of you, three of you, for the very rich papers. I enjoyed them very much. And I actually have to begin by confessing that I don't feel I can do justice to the rich papers you did. Especially, I have to confess that I'm still trying to digest Mana's arguments, which was too, let's say, theoretical for a simple-minded person like me. But I have prepared something, so I'll read my feedback, and then I'll pose one question to each of you. Mana here explored the complex way in which people operating in the 18th century Persianate world between Iran and India understood the origins of one another and of themselves, either as individuals or collectives. Kia pointed out that the natal lineage was far from being the only kind of lineage that mattered when accounting for one's origin or who one was. History of the service one's ancestors rendered to the rulers recognized in the history of the Persianate world formed what Kia called service lineage, for example. One's scholarly and esoteric lineage also mattered. Even the natal lineage was not simply biological, but had an aspect as a social arrangement, she pointed out. These various factors, all linked to the values shared by the participants in the 18th century Persianate world, constituted one's origin and who one was. Kia's presentation contributes to the purposes of this conference on genealogical history very much, as it reminds us, I think it has more bearings, but as it reminds us that genealogy in the sense of natal lineage does not operate in the vacuum, and that we always have to consider within what configuration it is claimed or negotiated by different actors. Kia's presentation at the same time urges us to contemplate upon what we exactly mean by genealogy to begin with. So we tend to use the word genealogy rather casually, but her theoretical contemplations on origins and what lineages may mean urges us to go back to the very notion of the terms we use. Now, my question to Kia is about the key concept of adab you use. As you said also in the presentation, you characterize adab as the proper form according to which relations between people became intelligible, gave meaning to both relationships regulated by law and those governed by social expectations alone. It governed how origins were conceived and narrated. It situated people and related them to one another. This emphasis that you lay upon the role of adab appears to indicate that your findings might not apply in the same way to the people who did not share the same adab. Although, of course, you are mindful of the humble that you mentioned during your presentation, but I'd like to ask you to elaborate more about the applicability of your argument to the people who are not as well educated as the highly educated mobile elites of the 18th century Persian world. Ahmed is not here, but I read what I've prepared for him. Ahmed al-Mazmi's paper discussed how and why a new theory on the origin of the Baloch was propounded in the latter 17th century by the court poet Nurani in his Jangnama, a Persian masnavi celebrating the exploits of Nasir Khan Nuri, the Baloch ruler of the time. Nurani not only recorded the prevalent discourse that the Baloch were descended from Hamza, the Prophet Muhammad's famous paternal uncle, but juxtaposed with it a new theory of an Israeli origin of the Baloch. Al-Mazmi's answer to why Nurani inscribed such a new origin in his Masnavi cannot be clearer. The Baloch ruler was in political and military alliance with the Afghan Durranis at the time, and the new Israeli origin could be expected to underpin that alliance because the Afghans had previously begun to claim that origin themselves. Al-Mazmi's own passage, the genealogical discourse was politicized and reinvented once more, for it was an effective tool in harmonizing diverging histories and alliances in times of political upheavals, aptly encapsulates the theoretical bearing of his finding. I have two questions to Ahmed. One is whether Nurani ever tried to conciliate between the two theories of origin in one way or another when he juxtaposed them in the Jangname. And the other question is what impact his new theory of an Israeli origin had outside the text of the Jangname, especially in the long run after his time. As for the latter question, what I'm wondering is perhaps the extent to which a top-down political invention of origin, like the one we attest in the Jangname, can be impactful in the face of a well-entrenched popular discourse. Daniel's presentation dug into multilingual family and community archives among the Parsis of Western India, which evidently preserves very rich information about the priestly community. In the priestly community among the Parsis, the rights each of its members held was clearly defined hereditarily according to the place that member held in the priestly genealogy. Daniel discusses a particular set of documents from the 16th and the 17th centuries that concern two priestly lineages, if I don't mistake, and elucidates how the claims to hereditary rights made by the members of the lineage were recognized and sanctioned by other priestly families and the state, so that the lineage, in the first case at least, came to hold authority over the Anjuman, or the collective body of priests. Interesting here is the fact that the continuity of hereditary successions among the priests was ensured by the institution of adoptive succession, which opens the possibility for negotiations surrounding its rules between the conflicting parties. Daniel's case study on the priestly Anjuman among the Parsis is of particular interest to me, especially because it involves the institution of adoptive succession, which at least on the level of the letters of the law does not exist in Islam. In Japan, we have the same similar institution, but in Islam, we don't have it. The Zoroastrian priestly genealogy is officially not based on the principle of linear descent, it seems. Here arises a question. You explained that the adoptive son is to be chosen from among the close relatives. But what were the criteria for choosing an adoptive son and heir from among them? Was the priority given to the closeness of kinship relation or to other factors such as the presumptive adoptive son's ability to succeed to the lucrative position? I guess both were important, but I'd like to ask your view to see what genealogy actually means in this case. Thank you very much. So I now turn to the moderator, and maybe I ask Mana and Daniel to give a very short answer to my question, and then I open the floor to the panelists. So Mana, please.
Thank you so much for your comments, and I think that your question is a very important one, and I know that I only hinted at this question of humbler people, and I mean, it's not one that I ultimately look at in the context of this book, but it's one that I'm thinking about. And I'll just say this. In the book, I do look at texts written by people who do not travel and whose texts are not that important, right? And I put them next to the more important ones to see what kinds of things are shared, right? One of the things that I do think is that many modern assumptions govern the way that we assume that culture happened, right? And so there's very often a particular idea of a difference between elite culture and that of the masses that is really a kind of understanding of authenticity that's very modern and located in the masses as the kind of understanding of the social body. But I actually think, and I'm really taking my cue from very recent interesting work in medieval European studies, that we don't know how culture worked, right? And we make a lot of assumptions that the people who are very educated are those, for instance, and this is in a lot of recent work in Persianate studies, are those who could compose original works. But what we don't take into account is how stories and the unit, for instance, of the hikayat or poetry or verse, how these were consumed, how they were experienced, how they were circulated, and even amongst the learned, the role that writing actually had in learning, right? And thinking about memory and memorization and circulation, and we can glimpse some of these in different kinds of sources. And I'm thinking, for instance, of tazkiras produced in Central Asia that talk about and include poets who can't write. And so those are people who actually can compose, but what about the people who consumed that maybe couldn't compose? And I don't think it's a uniform concept, but I think there has to be a kind of broader idea of how adab circulated. And so that's something I'm sort of grappling with now. I don't think it necessarily circulated in a uniform manner, but I do think that limiting a discussion just to text producers really kind of does us a disservice of understanding how culture worked.
Okay, thank you very much. Daniel, please.
Sure. Thank you so much for those comments and for your question, Kazuo. So I guess I'll try to answer that the question about the qualifications of an adoptive successor in two ways. So I guess first, what I would say is that, you know, part of my interest in these documents is to go beyond the sort of a history of Zoroastrianism, which focuses on sort of theoretical prescriptions found in texts, and move toward a social history of the Parsi priesthood to see, you know, to what extent the prescriptions that we find elsewhere, you know, translate at all into anything that resembles a sort of lived experience. So to answer your question, I suppose, you know, on the level of the prescriptive texts, first of all, which is where you see more of an engagement with that question, you know, there is a lot of literature which, you know, dates back to the Middle Persian texts of the 9th century, which says first that the preferable successor is actually conducted in the following way. The widow of the deceased should remarry, not as a there are three categories of marriage in Zoroastrianism. So she should remarry under the proxy category of marriage, which is specifically reserved for this kind of case, which basically allows her to be the temporary successor of her deceased husband until she has a child with another husband, at which point that child will be considered the adoptive successor of her deceased first spouse. So this is the sort of preferred way. That is, the widow remarries, and the first child from that marriage should be the successor of her deceased husband, at which point the remarriage is dissolved. That's what the sort of majority of the texts from the 9th century say about the preferred successor. But they also say that, in the case that that's impossible, a person, anyone, preferably from the husband's family, can become the successor, preferably a brother or a nephew, or possibly also a sister or a niece. They also say that an individual can be the successor for up to 40 others. So in theory, I suppose it's possible that one could actually be, brought into 40 different lineages, at least according to the prescriptive texts. When you look at the documents, though, it you never see instances of that, nor do you really seem to see specific instances of children born from widow remarriage. They talk about widow remarriage, but no one's ever said to be a son of a widow remarriage. So in these cases, what seems more commonly to be the case is that an individual who seems to have some sort of authority already within the Anjuman. In this case, like when we saw Mayor Girana, he was already the son, obviously, of someone of some merit. His father had been granted a land grant from the Sultanate, and he, even though he was adopted into his uncle's lineage, continued to exert a claim on his biological father's land. So it does seem that individuals, use this institution to, I think, accrue more material and communal authority to themselves when possible, and so I think that's precisely why, the second group of documents, the possibility of a widow naming a successor without the approval of the Anjuman seemed to be such a threat, because this was actually moving in on an institution which was allowing certain powerful individuals to hold on to certain power and authority, and probably wealth as well.
Can I add something about? Can I just add something about adoption? I do think that while it's not in the letter of the law in Islam, it was so widely practiced in India.
Yes.
Amongst Muslims. And I mean, there are even cases where Iranians come to India and they're like, oh, this practice is widespread. It's great. I'll do it too. So there was no sense of transgression involved in the practice.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to monopolize the floor. So now I open the floor to the participants. So those who have questions or comments, please raise your hand. Yes, Daniel Beben, please.
Hello. So I will use my prerogative as the introducer here to jump in. I have a couple questions for both of you, but I'll just save my first one for Dan here. I'm curious if you could say a bit more about this, sort of the framework around this procedure of adoption, or kind of the sort of the theoretical framework that is evidently developed within the Parsi community. And I'm wondering if there are ways in which this idea sort of filters out more broadly into social practices, or understandings of communal boundaries. What little I know of the Parsi tradition, I'm thinking about ideas about conversion, for example, that this idea of entering into the community is very, very strictly limited. I'm wondering if this, for example, has ever been used as a way to kind of expand a community, through a process of kind of accretion of new communal members, Or, is there other ways that it comes to be applied when thinking about the shape and expansion of the community?
Sure, thanks, Daniel, for that question. That's okay. So first, the sort of more basic elements of the framework of the adoption. I think there are various theories as to the origins of this institution in the context of late antiquity. People like Maria Matzuk in Berlin and more recently, I guess, Richard Payne have been writing about the late antique applications of this and its possible origins, in the context of the plagues of late antiquity, in which vast, estates were left without inheritors, what to do with these sort of questions of succession. But from the text that I look at from the sort of from the perspective of like individual eschatology and what happens to the soul after death. Basically when someone when a Zoroastrian dies, the idea is that their soul after 4 days travels to the other world, and it comes to a bridge, and someone in this world needs to be performing rituals on behalf of that other on behalf of the deceased for their soul to be able to cross the bridge, and that person normally would be their children, from among their children who would perform that ritual. If no one is present, then someone needs to be appointed to perform the ritual, which is why in Persian the proxy is called pol gozar, or the guy who gets you across the bridge. So in addition to that sort of ceremony of the 4th day after death, there are ceremonies which need to take place first every month after someone dies, and then every year thereafter, which would be performed by the successors. So from a ritual standpoint, those rituals are mandatory to ensure that a soul doesn't fall into hell, or in fact even to remain at the foot of the bridge, in sort of perpetuity. So there are sort of elaborate accounts given of these lonely souls standing at the bridge waiting to cross because they don't have intercessors that are given in these sort of otherworldly vision texts that we have in Zoroastrianism. So it's a subject of a lot of textual exploration, both with regard to thinking about what happens to the soul after death, but also in a lot of different sort of prescriptive legal texts that we have. Now, as to your question about communal boundaries, really interesting kind of question there. We know that the institution of was still on the books in Iran as late as the it's still part of Zoroastrian personal law in Iran. This institution of succession. In India, it was removed as having any sort of legal standing with the sort of passage of the sort of Parsi Family Law Acts in the 1850s, in which there were some lawsuits in which adopted children were trying to sue for rights to the estate, and the British courts decided that they didn't have a claim on the estate. But in any case, there is at least one case in which I'm familiar of, in which someone names a Muslim as their proxy. There's a text from like the Qajar period in Iran. It's sort of it's a question and answer sort of text, but it has this little narrative at the end in which a Qajar prince, is very sort of becomes very friendly with this old Parsi priest, and the Parsi priest names the Qajar prince as his Polgozar, and it's unclear whether the Qajar prince was ever thought to have converted to Zoroastrianism, but this text just sort of leaves it there as if this is not uncontroversial that someone appointed a Qajar prince to be his proxy and his inheritor. But no, generally speaking, there are other questions about bringing non-Zoroastrians.
Yeah, Daniel, can you?
Sorry, I have to talk forever about this. Obviously, I'm going to shut up now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Daniel Beben, did you have a question for Mana too? Or
I do, but I have to think about it a little more how to phrase it exactly. So I see Mana herself has a question. So
okay, then please, Mana.
So obviously this is a question for Daniel. So I was kind of struck, and this goes back to some of what you talked about in your answer to Daniel. I have two questions. One specifically, I was struck by the difference in the terms between Gujarati and Persian, where you have polgozar, right? And then you have like the term that you said is something like warden of the estate. And this really kind of highlights different features of the position. And I guess I wondered sort of how this compares to the way that it's undertaken in the context of Iran. Because, you know, one of the things that you're talking about is not just the use of inheritance in a particular way at a particular moment in the 17th century, but in fact, the attempt to change its meaning at a fundamental level by, for instance, cutting women out of it, right? And to the attempt to kind of keep the patrilineal things separate and to cut matrilineal descent even maybe out of it, right? And so I guess I just wondered, so that's kind of, how is this specific to India, what you're describing? And in what way, I was kind of curious at the end of your paper, you talk about people moving to Bombay as a place outside of the formal jurisdictions, which allows people to choose their priests. And does that also cause a change?
Okay, I'll try to answer this quickly so that we can get some, so I can flip these questions on you, Mana, but okay. So the linguistic difference, first of all, so the usage of the term politic in Gujarati, you know, basically is part of a broader trend of we find already in much older texts in which Persian and especially Middle Persian terms are translated into their sort of Sanskrit equivalences. And so there is a somewhat cognate institution in Vaishnava law as well, which is a Palaka Putra, which you know, has the same term Palak in it, in which a son is you know, it's basically one of the two categories of adoption in Western Indian Hindu law. So it seems just to have been, you know, applying a term that would have been familiar to Hindus to something that's a bit different in Zoroastrianism. But one, you know, these priests are multilingual, and so they say Palak when they write in Gujarati, and they say Polguzar when they write in Persian. So it, you know, they seem to have been seen largely as interchangeable. This question about cutting women out of the picture is something that I'm really interested in, because it's almost impossible otherwise. I mean, there are so few sources that talk about women at all in the Zoroastrian corpus, other than in extremely prescriptive ways, you know, to do with, you know, women's bodies and questions of purity and so on. So to find a place in which apparently, you know, women are exercising a certain agency in as far as I can tell, advocating their own families' interests, you know, was really sort of surprising when I was looking at these documents, and I don't think I really am prepared to say, you know, what is sort of specific about cutting matrilineal descent out in India yet, although it is striking to compare these documents to older documents in which a woman's right to appoint her husband's heir is emphasized. So I mean, there's clearly a big break between these documents that say a woman can't do this without the approval of the Anjuman, from documents from the 9th century which say a woman must do this, and you know, the Anjuman only, you know, comes in if a woman is incapable of doing it. So I mean, it's a complete opposite of the 9th century documents, and there's clearly something going on. It's just hard to pinpoint, I think, exactly what, unless it's just this broader question of two rival pantaks who are, you know, trying to shut one another out of any ritual opportunities. As for the question of Bombay, I mean, so much changes when Bombay becomes the center of priestly authority. basically, in Gujarat, the sort of collective body of making decisions about what priests do is the collective body of the priests themselves. Whereas in Bombay, almost all of the fire temples of Bombay are endowed by wealthy merchants who are part of, generally themselves lay people. And those merchants set up trust boards for their fire temples, and the trust boards now decide the regulation of the affairs of the temples rather than the sort of priestly bodies themselves. And at that point, you start to see conflicts between Navsari and Bombay, and the general sort of rise of mercantile interests over priestly interests.
Okay, now I don't find any questions through Q&A. Oh, okay, Walid. No questions through Q&A. So Walid, please.
Hi.
And then maybe Daniel, you'd like to pose your question to Mana after Walid, because we still have 10 minutes.
I will
Please,
see
Walid.
on time to Walid.
Okay, lovely. I have actually a response to Ahmed's presentation. I know he's not here, but I think it's going to apply to all of us. I agree with his argument entirely, but I'm actually wondering whether there's a missing piece in all of this, right? And this missing piece being genealogy as informed by markers in the built environment. That these genealogies are not simply dictated by, let's say, the political mandate of the author, in this case, aligning the Kalat with Durrani interests, but actually on a sort of shared memory tied to the visible environment. Otherwise, it'd be deeply problematic. So just a couple of points that across Las Bela and Kalat, you've got a whole sequence of these vast 50-foot shrines. I've been to a village with 70 of these 50-foot shrines in it, of the sons of Noah, Israelite prophets, which may well actually be mobilized into these narratives already with a pre-existing memory attached to them. What actually made me think about this was his reference to the figure of Muhammad ibn Harun, the Governor General of Makran, under whom bin Qasim comes into and occupies Sindh, that he's situated somewhere between Hamza and then the formation of the Baloch as we know them today. And this is absolutely connected to the fact that the oldest shrine in the region, or attributed shrine in the region on top of the city of Las Bela, is of Muhammad ibn Harun. It's a kind of anonymous shrine. And in the sacred memory, he's not just a political figure. He's actually this Ari Pir, the pious Pir who, even today, people say he appears every Thursday in white clothing and walks to the Sayyid graveyard and comes back. So it, all of this to say that there is, in each of these cases, there's one. I would not be surprised if, for example, there's a pre-existing grave of Balo, who then gets reimagined by Nurani as part of this lineage that's being, or the Afghan lineage that's now being solidified and written down in the North Indian context. So that was my response to that.
Okay, your response actually is recorded, so I think that Ahmed will be able to see your comment. Then Daniel, would you like to pose your question to Mana? I mean Daniel Beben.
Oh, no, but I think Dan Sheffield had a question for Mana as well.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I could talk to Mana forever. So Mana, thank you so much for this extraordinarily rich paper. I've been thinking a lot about blood and sort of its uselessness for describing so much of what we do too. And so I wanted to ask, I guess, in terms of the sources you look at, I think that adab is a really sort of important way of thinking about connections and so on. But I wanted to see whether there were, whether I could push you sort of more in the direction of the sources that I see, and see whether you find cognate terms, in your own sources as well. Do you ever see terms like, the Zoroastrian sources are so focused on words that have to do with textiles in terms of forming connections with one another. So we find word, a lot of tie roots. A connection is like a tie between two people. So we see, band and pevand and words like this that are used to describe the sort of links, between generations. We're just wondering, in terms of metaphors to think with, apart from place and language and so on, whether there are more sort of material metaphors in your mind, which we could use to perhaps productively think about genealogical links that move us beyond sort of bodily fluids and blood and so on. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I mean, I think that the language of ties and I see a lot of language of relationships, right? And it's not specific to textiles, although that's very interesting. And I guess the point that I was just trying to make is just that there are other relationships that can constitute those ties, right? Rather than just who gave birth to who. And the work that I tried to do in the chapters that I wrote on this was really to make visible the way that unpack our idea of natural, right? And part of the problem is that there's this idea that a patrilineal tie is somehow natural, right? But men don't give birth to children, right? And so there's a legal tie there, and there's an entire principle. There's an entire kind of, and I'm drawing here on Wa'il Halak's work, right? There's an entire moral edifice governing the law, right? And that is one of the ways in which it ties to adab, right? Which you can think of as it is about ethics. And so there is a way in which, the law might tell us who our siblings are, right? But adab tells us how we're supposed to behave towards them, right? And the lack has to be explained in the same terms, right? And so for me, adab became a way, almost like a heuristic, to kind of get around and parse out certain things to allow room for other relationships to become really important, right? And the way in which this language of family gets used in relationships, like, if you have a teacher, if you're a scholar and you have a teacher, the son of your teacher is like your brother, as are the other students who are there with you, right? And that can actually become a way in which to, more than one lineage can overlap, but that's not an insignificant relationship. And so just looking at who you're related to, either legally, right? And actually, in the world of where babies come from in the Islamic kind of understanding, right? The only person who gives you blood is your mother, right? Which makes it completely, in some ways, irrelevant to nasab. So, I mean, in a way, and I'm sorry if it's hard to follow, but I just wanted to open up more space for us to think without what I consider to be a very alien set of symbols that govern our understanding when we're looking at our sources. Because, after I read Gil Anijar's book on blood, I actually went back. I had started out by talking about origin as consanguineous and non-consanguineous. And I went back and I looked at my sources and I thought, oh my God, there's literally no blood here, right? And so what does that mean? Like, what can we come up with otherwise?
Okay, Daniel, is your question very simple? We only have 2
I hope so. I guess it's specifically for Anna, but maybe the rest of you, if you want to jump in as well. I'm wondering if there is, we've been really, in our discussion, de-emphasizing sort of biological aspect of nasab, but I'm wondering if there is perhaps also room for a biological understanding as well. Because what I'm thinking about is in our sources, there's also limits that are expressed on who can claim these relationships. I mean, one of the phrases that I see again and again in our sources from Badakhshan is this phrase, God's curses be upon those who claim to be Sayyids, but who actually aren't, which suggests there is some verifiable means of determining if someone really is a Sayyid or not. And whether that's by blood or something else. So I guess what I'm wondering is, where how is that actually verified then, if it's not biological? I mean, how is that concept understood? Kazuo, you might have something to say about this as well.
But we'll run out of time, certainly. Well, the current understanding of mine about what the genealogists were thinking was that although they were accepting the stipulations of Islamic law, so they paid respect to the testimonies, they were not totally, away from the idea that there should be some I'm not sure if I can use the word biology here, but something which is natural in the genealogical relation too. So they were, I think, very ambivalent in their attitudes because the social custom and the law was, as Mana emphasized, it didn't treat lineage or natal lineage as something biological. It was a social construct. But genealogists somehow seems to have wanted that it be a kind of natural and biological. So I find this ambivalence very interesting nowadays. I'm not sure if I have been able to make myself understood, but anyway, time is up. So we can continue this discussion perhaps later at the general discussion, if there is such a thing later. But anyway, I'd like to close this panel on the genealogy, translocality, and narratives of origin in early modern Persianate societies. And I thank two speakers virtually present here, and the third one, Ahmed, who was once remotely participated in this panel. Thank you very much for your participation and contributions.
So thank you all. We will take a 14-minute break by my clock. My apologies for being the cause of us going over time. And then we will meet again at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for our keynote speech by Dr. Ensign Ho. So see you then.
Hello and welcome back to our next session of the symposium. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker, Angsang Ho, Professor of Anthropology and History at Duke University, and Mohammed Alagil, Distinguished Visiting Professor of Arabia-Asia Studies at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. He was educated at the Penang Free School, Stanford University, and the University of Chicago, where he received his PhD. He is a leading scholar of transnational anthropology, history, and Muslim societies, Arab diasporas, and the Indian Ocean. His research expertise is in Arabia, coastal South Asia, and maritime Southeast Asia, and he maintains active collaborations with scholars in these regions. He's also co-editor of Asian Connections, a book series at Cambridge University Press, and he serves on the editorial boards of several journals, American Anthropologist, Comparative Studies in Society and History and Anthropology. He has previously worked as a professor of anthropology at Harvard University, senior scholar, Harvard Academy of International and Area Studies, country and profile writer at the Economist Group, and is director of the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. He is the co-editor of the book, The Indian Ocean, Oceanic Connections and the Creation of New Societies, published by Oxford University Press in 2014, and numerous journal articles and book chapters. But it is his brilliant ethnography, The Graves of Tarim, Genealogy and Mobility Across the Indian Ocean, published in 2006, that resonates with the work we are trying to accomplish in this symposium, and has had such a tremendous impact on scholars working on diasporic societies, on genealogy, and on transcultural studies. Combining ethnography and history, The Graves of Tarim studies the diaspora of the Sayyids of Hadramaut in Yemen, who moved across the Indian Ocean beginning in the early 16th century, creating a trans-regional community that exists to this day. This Hadrami diaspora, what Professor Ho calls the absent, the society of the absent, take their genealogies with them, writing new lineage histories that combine their Sayyid status and lines of descent with Sufi liturgies. Genealogy in his study, to quote Andrew Shyrock, is a cumulative genre. His keynote lecture today is entitled Genealogies and Partial Societies. Please give Professor Ho a very warm welcome, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanne, for the kind introduction. I'd like to first see if I can share my video properly. Do you see it full size or just a small
Not
size?
size.
Small sized? Is it small sized?
Yes, it's yes. Now you have it.
Is it getting bigger?
Yes, it's
Okay.
full screen now.
Okay, full screen now. Okay,
Yes.
great. Okay, excellent. Having some trouble with the Windows. Just give me a minute. Okay, thank you. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Joanne, for your kind invitation to join this exciting symposium on Persianate histories and genealogies. I have read many of the papers and am astounded by the wealth of genealogical material here. There seems to be an affinity between genealogical representations and generalizing schemes that stand for whole peoples, tribes, states, religions. In China, descent from Confucius sparked genealogies of other groups across China and abroad. In the Semitic world, descent from Adam and the prophets thread through holy books, historical chronicles, royal genealogies, travelogues of Sufis, conversion narratives to Islam. Many foundational stories weave these different genres together: the arrivals of Sayyids, the mediation of local disputes, elevation to leadership, conversion of locals to Islam, the establishment of a shrine in the tomb, descent of rulers from them, all within genealogical narratives. Daniel Beben says, I quote, "This tripartite structure of conversion narrative, shrine lineage, formed the bedrock of the religious life of much of pre-modern Central Asia, and in many ways continues to play an essential role among communities in the region even today," unquote. Along these lines, Ryan Tham, one of my students and a contemporary of Manakias in grad school, shows how the Sufi king lineage shrine text complex feeds into new nationalist genres of writing in Xinjiang today, and his book Sacred Roots of Uyghur History. Such representations take on linear forms that give the impression of a march forward or down through chronological or generational time. This is not surprising. Most scholars working in this field are historians. What I like to do is take this temporal dimension and add to it the dimension of space, circulatory space. The Persian world is a coherent space not only as a container of shared language, culture, religion, sect, or history. This space has been traversed by patterned, repetitive movements across its surface, along trade routes, market circuits, seasonal pasturage movements, festival pilgrimages to shrines. These spatial mobilities are social phenomena that persist through time. They have consequences for the formation, transformation, and reproduction of communities, societies, regions in the Persianate world. They fall out of view in event-driven chronological narratives of the arrivals of saints and the departures of empires like those of the Mongols. When we introduce the spatial dimension, we see that sociologically, societies in which genealogical representations are found can often be characterized as partial societies, with social groups that are mobile, circulatory, transregional, or intermediate in scale. What do I mean by partial societies? Think, for example, of a diaspora of merchants spread across nodal towns along trade routes, forming a subgroup in each of these towns, within which they might be distinguished by their language, religion, cuisine, specialty trades. Jews and Armenians are well known as such trading diasporas, Greeks and Muslims as well. The former have often been minorities, whereas the latter at times convert and transform their places of settlement in their own image, leading to the formation of new Hellenic or Islamic polities. Such diasporas are examples of partial societies because they are not self-sufficient, but are mobile and dependent on other communities and places elsewhere. They are partial because they are not sedentary mass aggregates such as French society or American society, theorized by modern Western social science. For them, we need a different set of concepts than class, race, status, and so on of classic social theory. We need concepts such as mobility, connection, circulational, transregional or intermediate scale, and so on. Drawing on research coming out of Asia, I have called such concepts inter-Asian concepts for mobile societies. This is in the Journal of Asian Studies. Where do such partial mobile societies intersect with genealogical representations? This question relates to questions asked by the organizers of this symposium. How is genealogy connected to networks of mobility, connected histories, and transregionalism? Is there a relation of genealogies to an institutional context and the built environment, such as a shrine? And more generally, what methodological and theoretical approaches do we utilize in the study of genealogical history? To answer these questions, I present material from the Indian Ocean, which parallels and overlaps with the Persianate world. I argue that genealogies are cultural creations that give representational shape to transregional networks of mobility and connected histories. They can do so because in textual form, they are fellow travelers to persons who are mobile. Mobile texts and mobile persons meet in ritual engagements at places like tomb shrines. Pilgrimages to shrines are part of travels for trade, visiting family, studying with teachers, seeking health, and mark them with special meaning. Tomb shrines become elevated from the immediate surroundings by such pilgrimages, as does the sending of their inhabitants, that is, people inside the tombs. Genealogies, which enable travel in time to ancestors and prophets, and in space to their tombs, do some of the work of elevation. When done well, genealogies can act as a bridge, suture mobile partial societies to local communities, and link them to universal religion. In the language of semiotic analysis, they allow one to perform symbolic work that enables a part to stand for the whole. They do the work of synecdoche. When we read these manuscripts from the Persian world, we should read them not only for the solid facts that can be sifted from the mythology. We need to also read them for the work of synecdoche they are often used to perform. This is the theoretical approach I adopt here. The material is drawn not only from bound texts, but also from tombstones, prayer litanies, pilgrimage manuals, ethnographic field material involving ritual practice, family interviews, and so on. The collection of these various forms of data is driven by a methodological imperative to follow things that are mobile. Things we will follow include trade goods, merchants, slaves, religious divines, all kinds of texts, lineages of persons, occult and esoteric forms of prophetic light, and so on. This wide-angle approach to data collection then gives us the possibility of interlacing these threads together for a more synthetic or rounded view of how the mobilities of different things may be interlinked. Such a rounded perspective can in turn give us richer hermeneutic readings of the texts that we are able to collect, often not that many. Let me now turn to the following two main things that are moving around: mobile persons and mobile texts. There has been an explosion of studies of mobile persons called diasporas as particular ethnic groups: Jews, Chinese, Indians, Armenians. I follow a diaspora, but one that is unusual. It is a diaspora which is not simply an ethnic group. Rather, it is a group which has both particular and universal sides to it. These are people who originate in Hadramaut in southern Yemen. Identification with the homeland gives rise to the particularistic aspect of this diaspora. This diaspora, however, has a universalistic aspect. Members of it have self-consciously seen themselves as spreading Islam across the Indian Ocean for centuries. They spawned families, communities, sometimes states. They became natives everywhere. This universalistic aspect did not appear in history fully formed. It was a cultural creation. You can see on the map where I've highlighted, the places where I've highlighted are places where you see communities of these diasporic Hadramis, essentially all across the ocean. We examine here a small but significant part of that creation. What was created was a missionary enterprise that yoked generations of Hadramis to a large geographical stage and made the whole world of the Indian Ocean their native habitat. In this enterprise, a particular lineage of Hadrami Arabs, the Sayyids or descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, and we've seen a lot of them here in this symposium, a particular town, Tarim in Hadramaut, and a particular oceanic realm, the Indian Ocean, were all transformed into a universal sphere of Islamic concourse and discourse. The Hadrami Sayyids were a particular segment of a particular people, yet they saw themselves as the active creators of a universal world. In this, the position is like that of the Sayyids who appear in so many of the papers at this symposium. In the Holy Quran, God says, "We have made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. خَلَقْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا." God did not make a universal race, but rather particular peoples and tribes. How were they to recognize what is common? How does one get from the particular to the universal? How does a part come to stand for the whole in semiotic terms? How did the Hadrami Sayyids think themselves out of a particularistic identity and dissolve their diaspora into a whole world of Islam? From the other side, how did they come to be accepted by Swahilis, Gujaratis, Malabaris, Malays, Javanese, and Filipinos as family members? So let's try to answer this question by following the movements of persons. Look at trade flows, the rise of empires, biographies, and so on, using data from a variety of sources. This is work of comparing and cross-checking, with which we believe something like positive or objective results turn up. But this objective sort of work is not enough, because when people move and travel, they also easily lose contact with each other and become lost. Lost to the homeland, married to natives, assimilated in other countries, no forwarding address, sometimes drowned in the ocean. If a diaspora is to exist over generations across continents, it must have means of representing itself to itself. It must have a mirror, as it were. And the Hadrami diaspora, persons wrote texts abroad. These texts have been separated from each other, thought of as belonging to different languages and nations. Reading them together, however, enables us to recognize that they form a canon of related texts, which build upon and modify predecessors, which refer to and cite each other. The creation of geographically expansive communities cannot be separated from the writing of such canonical texts. The texts enable them to be self-conscious of their very existence. So anthropologists call such texts collective representations. In religious studies, such groups are called text-centered communities. The religions of the book are such text-centered communities. The Talmud and the Torah are such texts around which Jews away from the Holy Land have continued to think of themselves as a people. The Bible and the Quran are such texts, but around which new open communities of persons can be formed. The canonical texts I'm talking about, however, form a broader range than these holy books. They come in different genre forms: genealogies, biographies, historical chronicles, pilgrimage manuals. The writing of these texts has to be seen as twin with the movement of the people. The two processes inform each other. The idea of mobility then becomes an interpretive key which sensitizes us to echoes of similarities between very different texts, to possibilities of connection between very different communities. Let me move now to the trans-regional context in which this mobility is taking place. Trade routes. So we have here trade routes from across the Indian Ocean. The rise of what we call an ecumenical Islam here is part of a shift in the Indian Ocean beginning in the 13th century, marked by the Mongol conquest of Baghdad in 1258. Up to that point, the maritime half of long-distance trade between China and Europe went through the Persian Gulf from China, went through the Persian Gulf up to Baghdad and overland across to the Levant. This was a long route which Chinese junks and Arab dhows traversed all the way from China to Iraq, the gray line you see on the map. With the fall of Baghdad, the caliphal peace across the Fertile Crescent was broken, disrupting transport of goods onwards to the Mediterranean coast, the Levant. In response, the maritime route from the east across the Indian Ocean began to shift from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea, the Black Line, arriving at the Mediterranean in Alexandria, Egypt. This rerouting of long-distance trade brought into prominence a series of cities now vitally connected with each other. Venice, Alexandria, Cairo, Aden, Cambay, Calicut, Pasai, and Malacca, all across the Indian Ocean. These were international emporias sporting dazzling arrays of goods. Foreigners were coming from elsewhere in increasing numbers, and new societies were being formed by their intercourse. These again are our partial societies that are so mobile. In Calicut, the Hindu ruler hosted 4,000 foreign Muslim traders in the 14th century, while Muslim Malacca in the 15th century hosted many Indian merchants from Cambay, Calicut, and the Coromandel coast. They became officers of the Malay court and some of its wealthiest merchants. In Egypt, Yemen, and Gujarat, foreign soldiers and slaves settled and became rulers, military officers, and state officials. The Mamluks in Cairo, Rasulis in Aden, and Muzaffaris in Cambay were such states run by foreigners and slave officials. So new Muslim states and polities were being created as foreigners took up positions of rule and influence. This was an important dynamic in the expansion of Islam across the Indian Ocean. Hadramis, especially the Sayyids among them, were a strong current in this restless ocean. By the beginning of the 16th century, the shifting trade routes had consolidated into three sectors: the Red Sea to Gujarat and Gujarat to Malacca. This reorganization of the routes created new Muslim port cities around the Indian Ocean from the 14th century onwards. The two Muslim centers amounted to the breadth of the Indian Ocean. Between them, Gujarat served as a natural fulcrum, grounded by its own dominance in textile production. Its natural market included both Egypt and Southeast Asia. This map gives us a stage for our two topics, the movement of persons and texts. Let's turn now to Cambay, the fulcrum in Gujarat in India. Cambay is where Hadramis first became influential. In 1407, a new Muslim sultanate is established there, the Muzaffarids. And I have a timeline of the Muzaffarid dynasty here. This new state drew in two sorts of foreign Muslims. First, Ethiopian slaves, otherwise known as Habshi Mamluks, who became army commanders and state officials. Second, religious adepts who became court counselors, Sufi sheikhs, judges, and teachers. The slaves were booty from war against Christians in Ethiopia, were bought in Yemen by Turks and brought to Gujarat. Torn from their families, they underwent social deaths and were transformed into new persons by education in two key skills, horsemanship and Islamic sciences. Many were tutored by Hadrami Sayyids, whom they would have met already in the Horn of Africa. Thus, as the Habashi Mamluks rose in the ranks of state service in Gujarat, they patronized their Hadrami teachers lavishly. The collaboration between Habashi slave elites and Hadrami Sayyids was an important feature in the development of the Muzaffarid Sultanate of Gujarat. So here we have, just to go through some slides, here we have a timeline for the Gujarati Sultanate. Across India, in other places as well, these Habashi Mamluks became very influential. In the Deccan, for example, in Bijapur, in Golconda, one of them, Malik Anbar, was able to hold the line against the Mughals. So this was the largest resistance to the Mughals across India. He was so successful that the Emperor Jahangir was quite upset with him. And you have this painting of Jahangir notionally shooting an arrow at Malik Anbar. Well, he never got to do so. And Malik Anbar, whom you see depicted here, quite a rugged individual, died peacefully in his bed and was buried in this fabulous mausoleum. So this gives you a sense of some of the what the Habashi Mamluks were able to achieve in terms of social mobility in India. Now let's look at more closely at some of them as individuals. So one of them, Rehan Badr ad-Din Jahangir Khani, was one of these Habashi Mamluks. He was proficient in writing and account keeping. He had become a minister and shared his success with his teacher, the Hadrami Sayyid Sheikh bin Abdullah al-Aidarus. Rehan's scribe observes that, I quote, he loved the pious and devoted himself to serving the Wali of the Holy, son of sons, Sheikh bin Abdullah al-Aidarus. He was encompassed by Aidarus' favor, and through al-Aidarus, the creed was perfected in him. He became famous for his piety. Thus, he gave Al-Aidarus his due in many poems and expended whatever he possessed in his service. Both the slave and all he owned was for his master. Rayhan loved the Hadramis, especially the Sayyids. He was fond of those closest to the Sayyids, and in this way, his charity extended to those of the Arab race. Rayhan enjoyed being in the reflected glow of the Aidarus light, which afforded him the chance to display his literary culture and achieve renown for his piety. Hadrami Sayyids who were held in such regards, such as Sheikh bin Abdullah al-Haidarus, were rewarded for the ability to bestow such favors. Another of the slave nobles, Sharwan Khan, was not so pious. He was given to the good life, almost never seeing the crescent moon once in a month in a sober state. He was always drunk. He was an Ethiopian leader in the army in Baroda. His annual income was 200,000 Mahmudis. He particularly favored Abdullah Sa'id al-Hadrami, a Hadrami Sufi, for his musical abilities. Another of them, Ghalib Khan, had been purchased in Yemen and grew up to be both a horseman and an administrator. He was treated kindly and became something of a scholar. He completed the Quran, studied books of jurisprudence, hadith, commentary, distinguished between the permitted and the prohibited, was read in literature. Unlike Sharwan Khan, the perpetually drunk Mamluk, Ghalib Khan's sober interest in jurisprudence led him to associate with Hadramis, and even when he was traveling, a party of Arab Sayyids and theologians of Yemen remained in his house. Another of these Ethiopian slave commanders, Bijli Khan, was known for a number of things, including his services to the Hadrami Sayyids of Tarim. He would provide slave concubines for those of them impatient for marriage, preserving them from sin. These brief examples show that there were many opportunities for Hadramis to receive patronage from the foreign slave nobility of Gujarat, their erstwhile students. Hadrami religious adepts of different talents could find reward with such patrons for musical ability, legal erudition, luminous fame, and the chance of transport to paradise. Now, by the 17th century, Hadrami Sayyids in India had become key figures in their own right, no longer tied to particular patrons. Some of their tombs had become pilgrimage destinations. In the preeminent port city of Surat, they would at times of crisis lead the whole city in prayer. In 1735, the Navy blockaded the port just when the ships of the Surat merchants were loaded with goods for the annual Hejaz convoy. 1,000 pilgrims were gathered to journey to Mecca. While the interests of almost the whole city became shared in the crisis, only the Hadrami Sayyids were able to provide a face and a voice for the general public opinion and interests, for the city was rent by competing commercial and ethnic jealousies. The Sayyids remained above it all. By the 17th century, a Hadrami Sayyid could journey throughout the Indian Ocean from Hadramaut to Aden, Mecca, Gujarat, from the house of one kinsman in each place to another, and study with teachers who were uncles, cousins, brothers. It becomes easy to see how an Ethiopian slave starting out in the Red Sea might attribute his later success in Gujarat to the patronage of Hadramis, who were public figures apparently everywhere he went. The shifting trade routes, the rise of new port polities, and the Habashi-Hadrami collaboration show us how nodes were created in a larger network of trade and politics. This provides the overall social context in which persons were mobile. This context provided potentials which could be developed further. From here, we see that cultural work was performed on the potentials embedded in this context. That work was of two kinds. First, the nodes and Hadrami persons present in them were linked in a grand genealogy. Let me try to give you a picture of that grand genealogy. Here is a picture of that grand genealogy. So this is a genealogy with the lines going, instead of down, sideways, and side lines, sub-branches going down here. You will see that a number of names in this genealogy have annotations which say this person died in this year and in this place. So together with the genealogy is a narrative of places. So this is why it is a diaspora in a genealogy. This genealogical linking provides a structural form to the diaspora and gives it a trans-regional shape. Second, the genealogy was given religious content as a mystical light which traveled. This light was the light of creation, deposited in the Prophet Muhammad and passed on through his descendants. The spread of this universal light as these particular persons travel in turn gives a religious shape to the transregional space inhabited by the Hadrami diaspora. This conjoining of prophetic genealogy with the diaspora starts to give an answer to the question we began with. Where do such partial mobile societies intersect with genealogical representations? The cultural work required to develop answers was done in a new kind of text written in Surat in India in the 16th century. This is the Tarikh an-Nur as-Safir, the traveling light unveiled, written by Abdul Qadir bin Sheikh al-Aidarus and completed in 1603. He was born in Surat in Gujarat, the Creole son of an immigrant Hadrami Sayyid and an Indian mother, a manumitted slave. The book was a new kind of hybrid text which combined two different genres, the annalistic historical chronicle and genealogy. It is like other chronicles organized by the march of the years, recording the important events of each year. The book covers 100 years, the 10th century Hijri or 17th century CE, and the route Egypt, the Hejaz, and Western India in space. This whole trans-regional space appears vividly in Aidarus's chronicle. Death notices of jurists, historians, saints, pious persons, and kings, floods, fire, rain, earthquake, eclipses, comets, even inflation, novelties such as coffee, card, and the Portuguese all show up. The book feels like a newspaper where events separated geographically jostle each other on the page. A dominant image emerges of particular localities held together by a skein of common reference books in religion, law, language, of scholars whose itineraries and genealogies span the space. Kings appear as local parochial potentates who help or hinder the scholars. In their mobility and their common curriculum, the scholars encompass the sultans. In Aidarus's text, Hadramis are one stream in a universal concourse of Muslim scholars, Sufis, and sultans. This it shares with the other historical chronicles. However, embedded within the analytic narrative of events is an alternative chronology. This is Muhammadan prophetic genealogy. This is new to the genre of centenary chronicles. Adding genealogy creates a hybrid text. How is this hybridization done? For an empirical history replete with names, dates, and places, the Traveling Light Unveiled has a surprising preface. This preface is full of mystical, symbolic, figural terms. Here's an extract to convey the flavor of it. I quote, "Know that when God wanted to bring his creation into existence, he brought out the Muhammadan reality from his eternal lights. He then peeled from it all the worlds. God told Muhammad about his prophethood and charged him with spreading his message. He was the prophet of prophets, an intermediary for all the pure ones, while his father, Adam, was still between spirit and body. As the prophet said, God Almighty wrote the dimensions of human beings 50,000 years before making the skies and earth, while his throne was still on the water." Unquote. What we have here is an example of the prevailing intellectual culture of the Islamic Indian Ocean Red Sea of the period. In it are conjoined mystical and legal discourses centered around the Prophet Muhammad. Hadith is key to this conjunction. It is a source not only for legal prescriptions, but for imaginative renderings of the personhood of the Prophet as well. Al-Aidarus's preface contains symbolic Ibn Arabi-inspired content rendered in poetic forms. It acts like a mawlid, or celebration of the birth of the Prophet, which is read on ritual occasions such as Hadras. Hadra literally means presencing of the Prophet. Such rituals are led by Hadramis across the Indian Ocean today. This molid then acts like a cosmogony which begins a history described in the rest of the book. In this cosmogony, light is a key symbolic element and is transmitted to Muhammad through the prophets before him. Aidarus writes of the light, quote, "When God created Adam, he put the light in his backbone, and it shone from his forehead. When he died, his son Seth was the executor of his wishes, as was his son after him, that this light would not be placed in any but the purest of women. This order was carried out until the light arrived to Abdullah, father of Muhammad, in a pure state from the fornication of the Jahiliyyah, as the Prophet has said in numerous hadith." This transmission of the light down to Muhammad may be called genealogical prophecy, in which Muhammad's prophetic predecessors prefigure him. Past Muhammad, the light is transmitted through his living historical descendants, the Sayyids. This channel may now be called prophetic genealogy. It is at this point that the title of Aidarus's book becomes clear. The Tarikh an-Nur Asafir concerns a light which becomes unveiled as it travels through history. Prophetic genealogy, which the Hadrami Sayyids are part of, becomes a vehicle for the transmission of that light. It is this genealogy that connects the cosmogony and the analytic history in Aidarus's book. How does it do so? Within the flow of years and events is embedded a genealogy of generations of the Sayyids. Key figures in this genealogy are given special attention, and they are connected to each other over and above the chatter of events. These connections take the form of similar feats of holy men, symbolic metaphorical associations, nominal similarities, and genealogical descent. The names of Sheikh and Abdullah, for example, are repeated in successive generations, resulting in someone having the name, I don't seem to have that. Sorry about that. Resulting in someone having the name Sheikh bin Abdullah bin Sheikh bin Abdullah bin Sheikh bin Abdullah al-Aidarus. In the biography of his father, whose name is Sheikh, the author draws comparison with the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad had been given his name, which means the praised one, before his praiseworthy qualities appeared. Similarly, Sheikh was given this name before it was known that he would become one. He fulfilled his name in three senses. He lived to an advanced age, Sheikhucha. He was a sheikh in the sense of leader of the Sufis of his age, and he was a sheikh in the sense of teacher of students in the exoteric senses, as exoteric sciences. Aidarus concludes that God had inspired the naming of Sheikh in order that he realized his inheritance from his predecessors, just as God had inspired the folk of the chosen Prophet Muhammad in naming him the praised one before his praiseworthy qualities appeared. In his very name, Al-Aidarus's father participates in a genealogy which is not only spiritual, but grounded in places as well. So if you look at this genealogy I have here, it goes from bottom up, Sheikh bin Abdullah bin Sheikh bin Abdullah bin Sheikh bin Abdullah, the Grand Aidarus. So this is a genealogy here. There are these genealogical links. And between certain figures, special figures, you have these metaphoric associations. Now on this side, you have burial places. So when you have someone who is called Sheikh, Sahib or Principal of Dawlatabad, Sheikh, Principal Sahib of Ahmedabad, Abdullah the Grand Aidarus, Sultan of the Notables, you have a metonymic relation being constructed between person and place. And this metonymic relation between a person and place creates then an itinerary of pilgrimage sites. Al-Aidarus's father is Sheikh, Principal of Ahmedabad. He was the spiritual teacher of the Mamluk official Raihan Badr ad-Din Jahangir Khani, as I mentioned, and is buried under a cupola, a kubba, in Ahmedabad, capital of Gujarat. His grave became an object of pilgrimage. The term I've translated as principal, sahib, is often used for a celebrated pious person whose tomb in the place is the object of pilgrimage cults. The chain of names Al-Aidarus's father participates in is also an itinerary of pilgrimage sites scattered around Gujarat and the homeland Hadramaut. An individual in this way is connected to many persons and places, opening up a whole geography for others to travel, visit and participate in. Through these special names tied to places, Aidarus's genealogy moves beyond the text to connect with places such as tombs. The meeting of prophetic genealogy and grave, as I've indicated here, person, place, metonym, is a semiotic act which links a universal realm to a particular place through a metonymic operation. Remember that within the genealogy itself, links are created between figures that are similar to each other in metaphorical relations over here. The articulation of genealogy with grave thus puts a series of grave sites into semiotic relation with one another through a combination of metonymic and metaphorical operations. Pilgrimages to the graves of persons embedded in such genealogies perform such semiotic operations. Now, let me say this in another way through the use of visuals, and this is what I really wanted to do with this presentation. Here are some slides from a book published in 1998. You will recognize in it elements from Aidarus's Traveling Light, which we have been discussing. So this is the cover page of the book. Okay, you see it bigger here. So the title is Al-Bad'a Al-Muhammadiyya At-Tahira Min Duriyat Muhammad bin Ali Sahib Mirbat. So Al-Bad'a is a word which is used for Fatima, the Prophet's daughter. The Prophet is reported to have said, Fatima bad'atun minni. That is to say, Fatima is a part of me. And in this book, you see that from Fatima, you have this line descended down to someone who is called Sahib Mirbat. That is to say, the principal of Mirbat, which is a place in Oman today. And Sahib Mirbat is the ancestor of all the Hadrami Sayyids. So this is Mirbat, which is described in this book. And this is the tomb of Sahib Mirbat with these genealogies over here by the wall and on the tombstone. And this is the descendant of one of his helpers who is still the keeper of the tomb today. And this is what Mirbat looks like with the photos on the right. Now, if you flip the book to the back in the other direction, what you have is a genealogy starting from Adam with the date Adam, and he says whose grave is in India, or often people say in what is Sri Lanka today, or Ceylon, and also Eve, whose grave is in Jeddah, and Jeddah, of course, refers to Eve, the grandmother. And this genealogy then goes across the book through the various prophets, Noah, Shem, and so on. And it goes down to the first of the Hadrami Sayyids who arrived in Hadramaut. His name is Al-Muhajir, or he's called Muhajir. Goes down to his Al-Muhajir in the genealogy. And you see in these opposing pages, the genealogy then meets with the tomb or a photograph of the tomb. So again, here you have this metonymic relation between the place and this genealogy of persons. It is the symbolic operation is made right there. If you take then this tomb of Al-Muhajir, what you see is that on the tomb, in fact, is replicated the genealogy of the person. So here again is this metonymic operation of tomb and genealogy together. And you notice that this is all white because it was destroyed by Wahhabis or Salafis and reconstructed. So it goes down to the migrant's grave. The genealogy in the book then continues down to this one. So this is the same book. And this same book here, when it comes to Al-Aidarus, gives you his tomb with a cupola right in the Tarim cemetery. And this is the ancestor of our author, Al-Aidarus. Outside of this tomb, you see during festive occasions, you have these big crowds outside these tombs, and this gives you a sense of the social power the tombs are able to muster. So this is Abdullah the Grand Aidarus, Sultan of the Notables, main dome shrine at Tarim Cemetery. This is his tomb right here. Now this genealogy then connects to the figures we have talked about in Gujarat. This is the, so where was the, let's see. Okay, so this is the genealogy we're talking about. The father of the author of the book, Abdul Qadir bin Sheikh Al-Aidarus, is Sheikh here, principal of Ahmedabad, with a dome shrine. And here you see his dome shrine right here. Inside you have his grave, and you have the someone prostrating at the grave. And over here on the wall, what we see again is a genealogy of the Aidaruses right where the grave is inside the cupola. This here is a grave of the author of the book, Abdul Qadir Aidarus. You see it's very well maintained, and around it are other graves, which basically gives you a sense of the community that gathers itself around these saintly figures as founding members of communities. Contrast that here with the grave of one of the sultans of Gujarat, and you see the architecture is very similar, except that this sultan's grave is not well tended at all. He's not popular, unlike the Sufi sheikh. In other places in India, especially, let's say, the most famous tomb shrine in India, that of Nizam ad-Din Awliya in Delhi, you see again this combination of tomb and genealogy. This is his Chishti genealogy right here. In the same complex, you have the, again, genealogy and a tomb of Yemeni here in the Nizam ad-Din Awliya complex. And the interesting thing about these combinations, this metonymic power of Sayyid genealogy and tomb complex, is something which attracts also the politically powerful. So Humayun built his tomb complex right around the corner from the grave of Nizam ad-Din Awliya. You can basically walk there between them in Delhi if you go to Delhi. So the traveling light unveiled formulates a model in which particular and the universal are brought together in the diaspora of the Hadrami Sayyids, first in Muslim Gujarat at the end of the 16th century. As a history, the book is placed in the world of real space and time, the Indian Ocean and Red Sea in the 10th Hijri century. It is a world created out of the markings of difference, years, names, countries. At the same time, there are figural, nominal, and genealogical similarities which arc across these separations, providing a higher level of connections throughout. They ultimately connect to divine creation and revelation itself. This combination of metaphorical and metonymic elements in the genealogy of these Hadrami Sayyids functions as a bridge or barzakh between cosmogony and history. In this sense, their travels abroad in diaspora are both a parallel and a continuation of the original revelation of Muhammad, which brings the universalism of divine truth to the particularities, that is, the different peoples, times, and places of the mundane world. In this way, genealogy ties what I have called partial societies to the universe of creation. And beyond that, the part is made to stand for the whole through such work of synecdoche. This is the work that lies behind the ability of Sayyids to emerge so often and in so many contexts in the Indian Ocean and perhaps in the Persianate world, in the founding narratives of various communities, polities, and regions. Aidarus's book gives one clear answer to the question we started out with. Where does genealogy intersect with pastoral societies? For Aidarus, the prophetic light, which travels with diaspora through genealogical and geographical space, becomes manifest or unveiled as it travels and illuminates the shape of the transregional space it traverses. The light also furnishes a religious content, filling the space of the Indian Ocean with the world religion Islam. In composing his book, Al-Aidarus creates a poetic synthesis which gives universal meaning to the particular diasporic lives and journeys of his family members and others across the Indian Ocean world. It gives them a way of being known among the many peoples and tribes of that world, and for the part to stand for the whole. As God says in his book, we have made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Aidarus's book is a cultural creation, which gives them a way of knowing one another long after the fact of creation, when the peoples have begun to mix. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating and raises so many different questions. And I know we want to go into right away into a discussion. So I'm going to open the discussion. I'm going to take my own prerogative and ask you something and a comment as well. My own work in the Pamir actually also addresses this interconnectedness, between genealogy and shrines. And I'm very interested in, you break the things that move down to two things, mobile persons and mobile texts. I'm wondering whether orality comes into this picture at all. The narratives that are not necessarily textualized in this mobility, and if you could comment on that, that would be,
Yes. Orality is very much part of it, because the text, and especially if you think about alphabetic languages, the letters are actually simply machines for the production of sound. So there actually is an oral terminus for all these textual transmissions, such that when you have rituals at tombs, at these pilgrimages, these various genealogies and prayer litanies are all read out. And this reading out of litanies, genealogies, and so on is part of the process of, let's say, making names famous and ring forth. And this is part of why you see things like what the Greeks call isonomia, Muhammad ibn Ali bin Muhammad ibn Ali. This sort of repetition of names creates, you might think of it as a sonic effect, or it's a way in which fame resounds, rings across down the generations. And I cannot emphasize enough how there are many of such poetic formulations. I've just given you one example in genealogy, but there are many poetic formulations which are read out in things, for example, like group prayers, in Molid sessions, where you have short meters, long meters, giving you different kinds of crowd dynamics. So there's a whole oral world, which I unfortunately am not qualified enough in, say, ethnomusicology to give you a proper analysis of, but here are some examples.
Oh, it's fascinating. Thank you. I see, can we actually stop share screen and great. Thank you. So I'm looking to see any hands up among the participants. We lost the, we're back. Okay, yeah. So Mana, do you want to go first? We see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering, I mean, some of this is, I very much appreciate what you're talking about when you talk about orality, but I guess the question I had, and this was in particular in reference to the way you frame genealogy in a particular way as a kind of mirror, as a means of representing the self to the self. And obviously I know the self is here a collective self as much as a individual self. But I wondered, is it always just to the self? And what do we know about how, because you talk a lot about how meaning works within it, but how is it received by an audience? Do we have any way of knowing that? Or, you know, does it get received differently?
Actually, when I say genealogy is a form of representation of self to self, that is one dimension of it. But genealogies have many, many different dimensions. So for example, if you have, for example, people who have never met one another. Let's say you have someone showing up in a village somewhere in the interior of Yemen. And when this person comes and speaks with sort of broken Arabic, the people there might think this person is from Somalia and a refugee, and why should we take him in? And as they go further in discussion, when they ask, who are you and so on, this person then says, well, my great-great-grandfather came from this town. And he then narrates a series of names going upwards. At some point, the locals can actually recognize if you have a series of names, let's say 5-6 generations up, and then after 5-6 generations, you start to have a series of names which the locals can actually recognize as part of their own genealogy. So it is not simply one of self, but it is also a means of, you could say, decentralized accounting, in which different parties can link with one another. So there are very practical ways in which genealogies are linked also.
Other questions or comments? And I can't see the Q&A. I can only see the chat. Pete, is it possible to see the Q&A as well? Okay. All right. So other questions? I mean, I have so many. I certainly I think this, you know, I guess the other thing that I was very interested in are the different kinds of texts that seem to be talking to one another. You know, that have this, you talked about, you know, and the creation of a hybrid text as well. Can you speak a bit more about how these different texts that you were talking about? I mean, I know you focus on the one at the end, are interconnected, and how they I mean the relationship between, you know, the text, the narrative, and then a built environment, you know, and then the built environment, you know, combines two. You know, you have these genealogies. Some of the genealogies in the digital collection that we've created from the genealogies of Badakhshan, actually from the walls of shrines.
Interesting.
Afghanistan,
Interesting.
especially in Afghanistan, but it's also in Badakhshan on the Tajik side. There are also genealogical texts. I mean, and that was one of the big ways that they were actually communicated rather than in a textual environment.
Right, right. I think this is one of the points I try to make, is that especially in Middle East or history sort of department, we often have text as our main sources of data. And if you think about it, if you actually go out to places and walk around, as you say, these genealogies are not only in textual form or not in bound manuscript text, they are in charts and so on. And I think we've had actually a dearth of scholarship that actually looks at the practical usage of text. And especially what I wanted to emphasize today, the symbolic operations that these genealogies enable. I tried to link it to pilgrimages, to rituals, and so on. But there are many, many ways in which they show up as well. Yeah, and this is basically, I suppose, a methodological point of maybe to say that we should be historians with muddy boots.
Yes, yes, definitely. Yes. Any other comments, questions? Mana. And I see Dan also has a hand up.
Daniel can go first.
Okay, go ahead, Dan. You're muted.
Okay, apologies for that. Let me make sure my mic gain is up. You can hear me now, I assume. Good. Thank you so much, Professor Ho, for this this fabulous presentation. We've all learned so much from your book over the years, and as someone who also works in Gujarat, I've always been struck by the parallels and also the differences between the materials that you so richly give life to and the materials I myself encounter. I think I have a bunch of questions, but one that came up just I think very briefly in your talk, but I always thought was a really rich aspect of the book, and I'm wondering if you could sort of share further thoughts on was other aspects of the sort of materiality of the Hadrami diaspora. I'm thinking in particular, you briefly mentioned coffee, I think, in the talk, but I remember in the book that there being a sort of a very rich discussion of the sort of parallels in the way in which the materiality of coffee also circulated along with the Hadrami diaspora. I'm wondering the sort of role of commodities in trade with in connection to sort of rituals of commemoration. If I remember correctly, there were places in which coffee was sort of offered in certain places. And sorry, my question is very inarticulate here, but I'm wondering, perhaps if you might share any sort of further thoughts you might have on the way in which the sort of commodities of trade themselves, become locuses of commemoration in among
I'll give you some ideas actually from the frontiers of this sort of diaspora, and take you to a place like the Moluccas in eastern Indonesia. Of course, the Moluccas are famous in world history as a place where spices come from. That's where the Portuguese first went to get spices from the Moluccas. So if you go to the Moluccas, there are some items which are highly valued. One of them is cloves. Cloves, of course, have in world history been quite important. If you go there, you see that there are in these islands people who look to plant cloves, cultivate them, harvest them, and so on. And embedded in this horticulture of cloves you have Sayyids playing very interesting, important roles in sussing out, for example, places in which, number one, they grow wild and therefore are well suited for cultivation. And these are linked to the ideas of what do you call the senses of smell. I've said something about light in my talk, but smell is also important. If you read the text, there's a lot on smell. We open up the grave for a saint. If one were to open it up, there are nice smells emanating from the graves, for example. So there's a whole association with smells, which comes up surprisingly in economic activities in places such as Eastern Indonesia. Another thing having to do with smells is what they call oud in Arabic or garu in Southeast Asia, which is this very highly prized wood. It is not actually like wood, but it is dead wood. But when it dies, certain fungus and bacteria come and convert the wood into oil, and that oily wood is hugely expensive across the Middle East. And again, the association of these Sayyids with smells and so on. And of course, this wood, oud, is used in all these rituals. Again, they have special roles basically in sniffing out this sort of thing. Final example I'll give you is gold. In the island of Seram today, there's a huge gold rush, as it were, gold rush. And in this gold rush, again, gold, of course, is this shining material. And so all these associations with light come into play in this gold mining. So the economic aspect of this diaspora shows up in all these commodities in which the qualities, specific qualities of commodities become somehow interlaced with the distinctions that these Sayyids have in these very central ways, olfactory ways, visual ways, and so on. So these are some of the sorts of things which are actually very rich material out there, but haven't really been brought out.
Daniel, you have a hand up. Yours is no longer up, Mona. Do you still want to speak now, or?
I think everyone who wants to ask a question first should go first before me.
Back to you then, Daniel.
Okay, well, thank you. Professor, I really enjoyed your talk here, and I appreciate the quote from my paper that you made at the beginning there. Someone actually took the time to wade through that monster. I want to ask you about something that you mentioned.
It was quite long, but I enjoyed it.
Thank you. I think it was somewhat of a tangential point that you made, but it stuck out for me that you were talking about almost sort of the musicality of these genealogies and the repetition of some of the names. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that Joanne and I have often seen in these documents from Kazakhstan is there's these sections almost invariably in these genealogies where you have.
Sorry, there's a what? Sorry, I didn't quite hear you.
There's almost invariably a section in the nasab, in the genealogy, where it sort of falls back on, Ali, son of Ibrahim, son of Ali, son of Ibrahim. Mm-hmm. And the historian in me looks at this and says, well, these guys, they're just trying to fill up empty space at this point. Right. But I think you're introducing another possibility here, that there could be a sort of aesthetic quality to this, perhaps connected with, oral reading practices or something. So I was wondering if you could say a little more about that. I mean, it's just something I haven't thought about before.
Yeah, it is aesthetic, but also it is maybe, to use a word, spiritual. I use the word metaphorical associations in my talk, and this is actually a phenomenon you see in Greek, amongst the Greeks as well, and among the Jews as well. The Greeks actually have a name for it. They call it isonomia, which is this similarity of names. And this similarity of names is, I mean, if you look at it simply as a text, you might see, well, it's quite it's quite a stereotypical thing, and you might want to dismiss it in terms of its factual veracity. But if you look at it from the perspective of people who are naming their children, so in Arabic, there's a term called tayammun, which is a sort of to honor the grandfather. So you name your son after your father, and usually then it's the first of the first. The line is first, and so it's the son is named after the grandfather. So this is very common also. I don't know about other cultures, but in Arabic societies that I'm familiar with in the Arabian Peninsula, it's quite common, whether you are Sayyid or not. But if you are Sayyid and you're immersed in the sorts of texts I've discussed, which are not simply legal texts, they are texts of they are Sufi texts. They're rife with metaphorical associations and so on. Then these sorts of links can create spiritual connections across generations. And I would say that this is actually this is an important dimension of Islamic culture, which I think an excessively legalistic scholarship on the one hand of modern Islam, together with the scientific 19th century sort of scientific historiography we learn in the university, which squeezes out the metaphorical, non-factual narrative elements of any text we use, all that becomes squeezed out actually, but it is actually the stuff of Islamic culture and the manuscripts we read there. So it is a call to take it seriously, these things.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm very interested in that myself. Devin, you have a hand up.
Yes, you're hearing me now? Yes, okay. Yeah, well, Professor Ho, thanks very much. This is a remarkable presentation. Well, as I think we all expected. I was intrigued I think actually after the end of your presentation, with your characterization of genealogy as a kind of decentralized accounting. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to me that that certain parts of certain aspects of genealogical data, in fact, become a numbers game. There's not much meat to them. There are the human beings supposedly lying behind the names, but it's a matter of generations and multiple sons and daughters in some cases. And I've always been intrigued by the notion of shrines and their role in this complex that we talked about, as a place for receiving and concentrating and then transmitting, genealogical data. I think they serve that function, but they also serve that for the narrative meat, if you will, the stories, the accounts of certain saints, certain ancestors. And I wonder if you have a sense or can speak to the difference in the way shrines in far-flung regions where genealogies, where lineages spread, different ways in which the data is handled as opposed to the ways the narrative material is handled.
The data of the genealogies, you mean?
Yes, yeah.
Mm.
Taking it just as the bare bones family tree, as opposed to that narrative complement.
I'll answer your question in a backwards sort of way, and this is you see what I mean by backwards. So I know someone who has been a pilot with Singapore Airlines for a number of decades, and he is one of these Hadrami Sayyids. I met him one day in New York City while he was on a stop from a flight between New York and Singapore. And he told me he was writing a genealogy of his family. I said, okay, that's interesting. Why are you doing that? And he says, well, I'm now in my 50s, and there comes a time when you need to pass things down to my children. My children are now teenagers, okay? And he proceeded to tell me that his father, when his father was a boy in Singapore, he was quite naughty. And he was sent back to the homeland in Yemen to soak up religion and basically have no cinemas and bars to fool around with and learn religion. But when his father came back, his father then proceeded to go back to the nightclubs and all these sorts of fun things they have in Singapore. And he did that for a couple of decades. And finally, he became, in his mid-40s, an alim and went off to Malaysia to preach religion and make a living as a teacher. And it was from that point onwards, then in his 50s, that his father then started to write the family genealogy and pass it down to him. So what I'm saying is that the genealogies we see handed down from generation to generation essentially can be ways of actually giving one freedom in terms of a life cycle sense, where let's say between your 20s and your 40s, you're having a good time, but when you're in your late 40s and 50s, you write the genealogy and pass it down to your descendants. So what you get is in these genealogies, accounts of people who are, let's say, 50s, and all the in-between stuff is basically not presented in these genealogies. So in that sense, they have certain sort of data, but they are also hiding other kinds of data. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but it's a sort of backwards way of answering your question.
Well, we've actually come to the end, but Mana, I think maybe you should have the last point before we close. I think we can go a little bit later to fit that in.
I'll try and keep it short. I'm not sure how much of a question this is, but I'm really struck by the way in which the kind of relationship that you draw between genealogies and tombs actually answers a particular kind of question, specifically about what we've all noticed, right? Reading texts where places are described almost always in terms of the people buried there, right? And a place and the very kind of nature and character of a place is understood through who is there. And I think one of the things that you're talking about is making explicit a way that genealogy actually gives substance to place. It's a kind of mapping too, right? And this is more than discussion of collectives and selves. It's also about limbing and structuring a topography and landscape, right? And the way that this goes from the metaphorical back into the experiential, right? Because anyone who goes somewhere knows so-and-so is buried there and is very careful to commemorate how they went to that tomb too, right? And so the description of places becomes a narrative about how they went from here to there and visited this and that tomb. And you can't actually write about going to a place without also either explaining why you couldn't go or describing how you did go. And well, I just like the fact that this actually makes the substance also makes it so that like I think it opens up a huge number of questions about what it means, the indigeneity and character of a place itself at an essential level.
Well, when we deal with it as Islamic phenomena, it all sounds very exotic, but much closer to home. If you go to Paris and you go around the subway system, you basically go to sound this and sound that, sound this and sound that. You're basically going around. If you go around Paris, it's basically as if you are walking around in tombs or churches of various saints, saint this and saint that. So if you think of the urban fabric of Paris, it is not that different in terms of all these saints. If you go to Oxford, for example, you go to all the colleges, it's also saint this and saint that. So it's so common to us that we don't even see it. But in pre-modern societies, this thing is the stuff. It's just everywhere. If you think of the names of people in the English language, John, David, all these things, they are all saints and prophets. And there are not that many names in the English language. Many of them are saints and prophets. So it's in a funny way, this thing is very much there. We don't see it in the English or French language. But if you go back 2-3 centuries, it is all there. This is what Nietzsche was trying to say when he said that modern societies completely devalue genealogies, when genealogies actually were very foundational structuring principles in European culture in the past.
So there is another question that was in the Q&A, so I'm going to just pose that. It's from Robert McChesney. General question. General question for anyone to address. Can we think of genealogies as political strategies, ways to control the access to resources, whether at a family, local, regional, or transregional level? Since shrines are prominent elements of a built environment, to what extent is it possible to link struggles over control of that resource to the project of genealogy construction of shrine families? When genealogies are dated, does this perhaps suggest moments of crisis when the alpha family element needs to assert itself and reify its role? All insights appreciated, particular plaudits to members of the panel and for excellent presentations. So those are the questions he's posing.
Hello, Prof. McChesney. I hope you're having fun in Maine, if that's where you're coming from. When real estate is involved, the stakes often go higher, and I think the Parsis in British India know that very well. You have these important test cases where the Parsi trusts almost get handed over to some French wife of Parsi, rich Parsi, for example, and those are very formative events in these sorts of diasporic families in which chunks of real estate become linked to genealogical or kinship belonging, and the stakes become very high, and they can shape the way these societies, the way they do things for many generations further down the line. And it's true also of these Hadrami diasporic foundations as well. When you have real estate at stake, a lot of genealogy comes into play in all kinds of ways. I'll just, I guess, keep it at that. But whole dissertations are being written about this sort of thing.
Yes, yes. Well, I think that brings us to a close today. Thank you so much, Heng-Seng, for your wonderful keynote, and for the panelists, 3 wonderful papers. So we will resume tomorrow at, well, for participants, 8:45, but we'll begin at 9 with the panel on genealogy. We have 2 sessions tomorrow. Genealogy as discourse and practice is our first one. So have a wonderful afternoon, or if it's evening or the middle of the night. I think for Kazuo, it probably is at this point. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And congrats on a very successful symposium.
Thank you very much. We have wonderful people together here. And I mean, I wish we could just keep talking, but I guess maybe we can extend it tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.